Have you ever walked along a beach and wondered what secrets the tides might be hiding just beneath the sand? For most of human history, the very deepest, most profound secrets of our origins were thought to lie buried under African sun or in the caves of continental Europe. Britain, that little island on the edge of the map, was considered a relative newcomer to the human story, a place only settled when the world had warmed and the great ice sheets had retreated for good. But what if I told you that the sea, in a moment of casual violence, could peel back the earth to reveal a scene from a lost world? What if the simple act of a coastal storm could expose a set of footprints left on a muddy riverbank almost 1 million years ago? A message in a bottle from a time so remote it defies our imagination. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how we discovered that the human history of Britain is older, stranger, and far more ephemeral than anyone had ever dared to believe. It's a story of ghosts, of fleeting visits and long absences, of a land that was and was not Britain, inhabited by people who were and were not us. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always a joy to see where everyone is listening from, so feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's a wonderful reminder that while these stories are ancient, we are all sharing this moment together, right now, across the quiet expanse of the globe. Our story, then, begins not with a grand discovery in a sun-drenched valley, but on a cold, blustery beach in Norfolk, on the eastern coast of England. The place is called Happisburgh, a name that sounds deceptively cheerful for a stretch of coastline that is being relentlessly consumed by the North Sea. For years, the crumbling cliffs of soft, unconsolidated sediment have been surrendering their secrets to the waves. Local beachcombers and fossil hunters knew it as a place to find the bones of mammoths and the teeth of extinct rhinos, relics of the Ice Age. But in the early 2000s, something else began to emerge. Amidst the gravels and the clays, a flint napper, one of those rare individuals with the skill to spot a human-made object among millions of natural stones, found a crudely worked flint hand axe. Then another. These weren't the sophisticated teardrop-shaped axes of later periods. They were simpler, more primitive, belonging to a much older style of tool-making. Dating these finds was difficult, but the geological layers they came from hinted at an astonishing age, perhaps 500,000 years or more. This alone was a revolution, pushing back the clock on Britain's human story by hundreds of thousands of years. But the sea had an even greater secret to share. In May of 2013, after a particularly harsh winter of storms had scoured the beach, a team of archaeologists was surveying the foreshore at low tide. They noticed a series of strange hollows in a newly exposed layer of compacted estuarine mud, a surface that hadn't seen the light of day for nearly 1 million years. At first, they looked like simple erosional marks, the kind of random patterns water can leave behind. But as they looked closer, a breathtaking reality dawned on them. They were looking at footprints, not the fossilized tracks of animals, but the distinct impressions of hominin feet, our ancient relatives. There were the marks of heels, of arches, of toes. Using advanced photogrammetry techniques, they were able to map the entire surface before the next tide came in to wash it all away forever. The analysis revealed a small group, at least 5 individuals, a mix of adults and children, seemingly walking south along the muddy bank of what was once a great, long-vanished river. The largest print suggested a male standing nearly 6 feet tall. The smallest belonged to a child, perhaps only 3 or 4 years old. This single, fleeting movement, captured in ancient mud, is the oldest direct evidence of a human presence ever found outside of Africa. The sediments date them to somewhere between 850,000 and 950,000 years ago. Think about that. Not 85,000, 850,000 years. This is a timescale that bends the mind. This was a world without Homo sapiens, a world without Neanderthals. This was the era of a much earlier, more mysterious hominin, perhaps a species known as Homo antecessor, or pioneer man, whose only other significant remains have been found far to the south, in the caves of Atapuerca in Spain. And here they were, a family group, pottering along a riverbank in what would one day become Norfolk, on the absolute northernmost frontier of the known human world. The climate then was cooler than today's, something akin to modern-day southern Scandinavia. Great coniferous forests of pine and spruce dominated the landscape, interspersed with wetlands and grassy clearings. This wasn't an island. Britain was a peninsula, a finger of land pointing out from the northwestern edge of the vast European continent, connected by a wide plain where the southern North Sea now sits. That ancient river they walked beside was perhaps a precursor to the River Thames, flowing not towards London but north, out into a cold sea. And this leads us to the great, haunting mystery of the Habsburg footprints. Who were they? And what were they doing? The simple tools they left behind, known as Mode 1 or Older One style flakes, were little more than sharp-edged stones knocked from a larger core, useful for cutting meat from a carcass or stripping bark from a branch. They were survivalists, living in a world populated by formidable beasts, scimitar-toothed cats, mammoths, giant elk. The footprints suggest a moment of calm, perhaps a foraging expedition for shellfish, tubers, or birds' eggs along the river's edge. Were they a resident population, a permanent foothold of humanity in this northern land? Or were they merely seasonal visitors, a band of pioneers following migrating herds of deer or bison north during the brief summer months, only to retreat south again before the punishing winter set in? The evidence is so sparse, so achingly ephemeral. We have this one perfect moment, a snapshot of a family walk on a Tuesday afternoon 1,000,000 years ago. And then, silence. There are no bones of the people themselves, no evidence of shelters, no grand narrative. Just footprints in the mud and a few scattered stones. A whisper of existence before the world changed and the ice came. This first tentative chapter of humanity in Britain was not a grand opening act, but a fleeting visit to a world on the verge of being completely and utterly erased. The world those ancient people knew was an interglacial, a warm pause in a much larger and more dominant pattern of advancing ice. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth's climate had been oscillating, swinging between long, brutal glacial periods and shorter, gentler, warm spells like the one they were enjoying. These swings are driven by subtle, celestial mechanics. The slight wobble in the Earth's axis, the changing shape of its orbit around the Sun. Factors that together alter the amount of solar energy reaching the northern latitudes. For a time, the summers were just warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow. But the celestial clock was always ticking, and the balance was beginning to tip. The summers grew shorter, cooler. The snow that fell on the highlands of Scotland and the great mountain ranges of Scandinavia no longer melted completely. Year after year, it began to accumulate, the delicate white flakes compressing under their own weight, squeezing out the air, transforming first into dense, granular ice, and then into vast, crystalline glaciers. What began as a subtle shift in seasonal weather escalated over millennia into a geological force of almost unimaginable power. We call this event the Anglian glaciation, a name that sounds rather quaint and regional, but which describes the most extreme and transformative ice age in Britain's entire history. The glaciers born in the mountains began to flow, rivers of ice grinding their way down ancient valleys. As they met the lowlands, they coalesced, merging into a single, monstrous entity, an ice sheet. This wasn't a static blanket of white. It was a moving, churning, scouring agent of planetary change. Imagine a wall of ice, not hundreds, but thousands of feet high, perhaps a mile thick at its center, advancing southwards with an implacable grinding slowness. The sound would have been deafening, a constant symphony of deep, resonant groans as the ice shifted, punctuated by the sharp crack of crevasses opening and the thunderous roar of meltwater rivers carving tunnels deep within its belly. The sheer weight of it was so immense that it depressed the Earth's crust, literally pushing the land down into the mantle beneath. For any life in its path, there was no question of adaptation. There was only retreat or annihilation. The great coniferous forests that had covered the land of the Happisburg people were pulverized, torn from their roots, and swallowed into the base of the ice sheet. The animals, the mammoths, the deer, the scimitar-toothed cats, were driven south, forced onto the European mainland, ahead of the advancing cold. And the hominins, that small band of pioneers, would have been part of this great exodus. They had no technology to survive in an Arctic wasteland. Their world was shrinking, the resources they depended on vanishing under a relentless tide of white. They left, or they died, and as the ice pushed further south, it began its work as the world's most unsubtle landscape gardener. It completely rewrote the geography of Britain. Remember that ancient river the hominins walked beside, the one flowing north? The Anglian ice sheet acted as a colossal dam. As it pushed into the modern-day Vale of St. Albans, it blocked the river's path, causing a gigantic lake of meltwater to build up behind it. Eventually, the water had nowhere to go but to spill over the southern chalk hills, carving a new channel to the sea. This catastrophic overflow event created the course of the River Thames as we know it today, a permanent scar on the landscape left by an ice sheet that vanished nearly 500,000 years ago. The ice didn't stop there. At its maximum extent, around 450,000 years ago, it covered Britain almost entirely. It reached as far south as London in the east and the Scilly Isles in the west. The cliffs of Happisburg, with their precious footprints sealed in mud, were buried under thousands of feet of solid ice. The entire human story up to that point, every tool dropped, every butchered carcass, every footprint, was either scoured from existence or entombed deep beneath a frozen world. Britain, the peninsula, ceased to exist as a viable habitat. It became a polar desert, a high domed wasteland of ice from which ferocious, bitterly cold winds would have blasted across the plains of northern Europe. And so began a great and profound silence. For more than 100,000 years, not a single human foot would step on this land. The first chapter was over, erased so completely that for a long time we never even knew it had been written. This brings us to a quiet, unresolved mystery. We tend to imagine the advance of an ice sheet as a slow, inexorable process, something that happens on a timescale far beyond human perception. But geological evidence increasingly suggests that these climate shifts could sometimes be shockingly rapid. Could the onset of a glacial period, like the Anglian, be something that happened not over millennia, but over centuries or even decades? One hypothesis that haunts the edges of paleoanthropology is the idea that some hominin groups might not have been able to retreat fast enough. While the main populations would have moved south, small isolated bands living on the northern frontiers, like those at Happisburg, could have been caught out. Imagine a series of brutally cold winters, a sudden and dramatic expansion of the ice fronts, cutting off traditional migration routes. It's a chilling thought, the possibility of the last few pioneers trapped between an advancing wall of ice and a frozen sea, their world shrinking to nothing. We have no evidence for such a dramatic end, of course. It is merely a ghost story told by the geological record. But it serves as a stark reminder that this ancient world was not a gentle place. The Anglian glaciation was a hard reset, a brutal wiping of the slate. The land was scoured, reshaped, and then left in a state of suspended animation, waiting for tens of thousands of years under the immense, silent pressure of the ice. The end of a glacial maximum is not a sudden spring thaw. It is a slow, messy, and profoundly violent affair. For tens of thousands of years, the great Anglian ice sheet had held Britain in its grip, a sterile world of white. But the celestial metronome that had pushed the world into deep cold eventually began to swing back. The Earth's orbit shifted once more, its axial tilt subtly altered, and a little more of the sun's warmth began to fall upon the northern hemisphere. The ice sheet, a monument to cold, began to bleed. At first, the melt would have been a mere trickle, a surface sheen of water in the brief summer sun. But soon, trickles became torrents. Rivers of melt water, milky with suspended rock flour, began to roar from the snout of the retreating ice, carving new valleys into the naked, traumatized land. Great chunks of the ice front, destabilized by the melt, would have carved off with thunderous roars, creating temporary ice-dammed lakes that could burst with cataclysmic force. The land itself, relieved of the crushing weight of a mile of ice, began to rebound in a process called isostatic uplift, groaning and shifting as it slowly rose from its enforced slumber. What the ice left behind was not the lush green England we know. It was a scene of utter devastation, a landscape scrubbed clean down to the bedrock in some places and buried under hundreds of feet of glacial debris, clays, sands, and gravels in others. It was a raw alien world of mud and stone, pockmarked with kettle lakes, where colossal buried icebergs had finally melted. Yet, life is nothing if not opportunistic. Into this barren scene, the first pioneers returned, not humans, but plants. Hardy tundra vegetation, mosses, lichens, and dwarf willows crept northwards, their seeds carried on the wind. As the soil slowly developed, these were followed by birch and pine, and then, as the climate continued to warm, a complete transformation took place. This new warm period known as the Hoxnean Interglacial, which began around 424,000 years ago, was in many ways even more pleasant than our own. It was warmer and wetter, a time of almost subtropical lushness. The pioneering forests gave way to a dense, closed canopy woodland, a temperate rainforest of oak, elm, hazel, and hornbeam that would have dwarfed any ancient woodland remaining today. And into this reborn world, this veritable Eden, came the animals. They streamed north from their glacial refuges in southern Europe, across the wide land bridge that still connected Britain to the continent. And these were not the familiar creatures of the modern countryside. This was a land of giants, herds of straight-tusked elephants, beasts far larger than any modern African elephant, moved through the forests, their passage creating open glades and pathways. Two species of rhinoceros, the gentle, grass-eating Merck's rhino and the formidable narrow-nosed rhino, browsed the woodland edges. In the rivers and wetlands, hippopotamuses wallowed, and moving among them were vast herds of red deer, wild boar, and the magnificent giant deer, Megaloceros giganteus, with its breathtaking 10-foot span of antlers. This abundance of herbivores naturally supported an impressive array of predators. Cave lions, larger than their modern African cousins, stalked the herds, as did wolves and scimitar-toothed cats. Britain had become a hunter's paradise, a landscape teeming with life, energy, and, of course, immense danger. Into this vibrant, challenging world stepped a new kind of human. The long silence that followed the Anglian glaciation was broken not by the descendants of the Happisburg people, but by a different, more advanced hominin, Homo heidelbergensis. Taller, more powerfully built, and with a brain capacity approaching our own, these were formidable and intelligent beings, the likely common ancestor of both the Neanderthals in Europe and our own species, Homo sapiens, in Africa. Their arrival in Britain was not a tentative exploration, but a confident colonization of a rich and promising new territory. They brought with them a revolutionary new technology, a quantum leap beyond the simple flakes and choppers of their predecessors. This was the era of the Acheulean hand axe. Beautiful, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped implements, bifacially worked from large flint nodules. These were the Swiss Army knives of the Paleolithic. They could be used for butchering a carcass, for chopping wood, for digging up tubers, or as a core from which smaller, sharper flakes could be struck. Finding one of these axes is to hold evidence of a mind capable of forethought, of planning, of seeing a finished, symmetrical form within a rough block of stone. This leads us to the central mystery of the Hoxnean people. We have their tools, and we have the bones of the animals they ate, found at key sites like Boxgrove in Sussex and Swanscombe in Kent. But what was their world truly like through their eyes? The sheer density of evidence at some of these sites is staggering. We find not just one or two hand axes, but hundreds. We find the bones of dozens of giant animals, many bearing the unmistakable cut marks of flint tools. This was not just scavenging the occasional leftover from a lion kill. This points to something far more complex: organized cooperative hunting. Consider the challenge. How does a small group of hominins, armed only with wooden spears and stone axes, bring down a 10-ton, straight-tusked elephant? It seems an almost impossible feat, something requiring not just immense courage, but sophisticated strategy and communication. Did they use fire to drive beasts into marshy ground where they would be trapped? Did they work as a team with some distracting the animal, while others moved in to strike at its vulnerable legs and underbelly. The success of these hunts implies a level of social cohesion and planning that hints at the foundations of language and abstract thought. They weren't just reacting to their environment, they were actively shaping it, targeting the largest and most rewarding prey, a clear sign of confidence and mastery. For a time, perhaps for 50,000 years, Homo heidelbergensis were the undisputed masters of their British domain, a small but successful population thriving in a warm, green, and dangerous Eden. To truly understand these new people, these masters of the Hoxnean Eden, we must zoom in from the wide green panorama of their world to a single specific place. Our destination is a gravel quarry near the village of Boxgrove in West Sussex, a place that, 500,000 years ago, was a very different landscape. Imagine a wide, flat coastal plain fringed by the ancient English Channel to the south. Chalk cliffs, very much like the white cliffs of Dover today, rose up behind the plain, and at their base, a series of freshwater springs bubbled up, creating a marshy, attractive area for animals. It was a natural crossroads, a place where the megafauna of the forests and grasslands would come to drink, and where the great animals gathered. Their hunters were never far behind. The fine silts and muds that accumulated around these springs created a perfect environment for preservation, an anaerobic tomb that would capture and hold moments in time with almost unbelievable clarity. The excavations at Boxgrove in the 1980s and 90s revealed not just a campsite, but an entire landscape, a pristine prehistoric surface sealed for 500,000 years. What archaeologists have called a Paleolithic Pompeii. Here, scattered on this ancient ground, lay the evidence of the hunt, the bones of giant deer, of horses, and most impressively, of the formidable narrow-nosed rhinoceros and the straight-tusked elephant. But these were not just random scattered bones. They were the leftovers from a feast, the remnants of a highly organized and systematic process of butchery. And everywhere among them were the tools of the trade, hundreds upon hundreds of exquisite Acheulean hand axes. Let us pause for a moment on these objects. They are often found in such great numbers and are so beautifully made that it forces us to reconsider what we mean by a tool. To create one, the flint knapper had to select a large, high-quality nodule of flint. Then, with a harder stone used as a hammer, they would begin the rough work of shaping, knocking off large flakes. But the final stages required a delicate touch, using a softer hammer made of antler or bone to press off thin, flat flakes, carefully thinning the edge and refining the perfect, symmetrical teardrop or ovate shape. The result is an object that is not only functional, but also possesses a tangible beauty and a satisfying heft in the hand. The symmetry is often far more perfect than pure function requires, and this is a deep mystery of the Acheulean. Why go to so much trouble? Some have hypothesized that this obsessive symmetry reflects a developing cognitive ability, an appreciation for abstract form. Others have even suggested, more controversially, that these axes served a social function, that the skill to make a beautiful axe was a display of fitness and intelligence, a way of attracting a mate, not unlike a peacock's tail. Whatever the reason, the ground at Boxgrove was littered with them, many in mint condition, their edges as sharp as the day they were made, dropped alongside the carcass they had just helped to dismember. The evidence on the bones tells the story of what happened here. Microscopic analysis of the animal remains reveals a clear and deliberate pattern. Fine, sharp cut marks from flint flakes show where the hominins first sliced through the thick hides. Deeper, heavier cut marks, often in parallel sets, show the systematic removal of the great muscles of the limbs and torso. This was not a frantic, hurried smashing of a carcass. It was the work of expert butchers. They knew the anatomy of these great beasts intimately. They knew where to cut to disarticulate the joints, to separate the ribs, to remove the tongue, a prized fatty organ. The cut marks often lie underneath the tooth marks of scavenging animals like wolves or hyenas, proving that the hominins got there first. This was not scavenging, this was primary access. They were the ones making the kills. Imagine the scene. A small group of Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps 10 or 12 individuals, has managed to isolate and bring down a giant horse near the spring. The danger is not over. The smell of blood will soon attract lions and other predators. Working together with practiced efficiency, they descend upon the carcass. Some use sharp flakes to begin the difficult task of skinning. Others use the heavy hand axes as cleavers, hacking through tendons and ligaments. The air is filled with the rhythmic sound of flint striking bone, of grunts of exertion, and perhaps of a rudimentary language used to coordinate the task. Once the main muscle masses are removed, the work continues. They use hammerstones to smash open the thick limb bones, exposing the rich, fatty marrow inside, a vital source of calories. This process, too, leaves its telltale signature in the form of percussion marks and impact fractures on the bones. What we see at Boxgrove is a snapshot of an entire food processing event. They seem to have done most of the butchery right there at the kill site, suggesting a degree of security and confidence in their dominance of the landscape. And this raises the profound question of how they were killing these animals in the first place. The archaeological record is frustratingly silent on this point, as wooden artifacts rarely survive. But at another, slightly later site in Schöningen, Germany, a set of perfectly preserved wooden spears from this same period were found. They were not simple sharpened sticks. They were sophisticated weapons, carved from spruce, their weight balanced towards the front like a modern javelin. It is almost certain that the hunters of Boxgrove were armed with similar spears. They were not just butchers. They were a coordinated hunting party, capable of taking on the most formidable animals of their age. They were, in every sense, the master butchers of this ancient British plain, their lives a testament to a level of skill, cooperation, and intelligence that laid the groundwork for all the human chapters yet to come. The scene at Boxgrove is so complete, so vivid, that it feels as though the hunters have only just stepped away, leaving their tools and the remains of their feast for us to find 500,000 years later. We have the stage, the props, and the supporting cast of animal bones. The only thing missing from this incredible diorama is the lead actor. For all the hundreds of hand axes and thousands of butchered bones left by Homo heidelbergensis across Britain, the physical remains of the people themselves are almost phantom-like in their scarcity. Human fossils from this period are among the rarest and most precious finds in all of archaeology. Think of the sheer improbability of it. An individual dies, their body must escape being consumed by scavengers. It must be buried rapidly in fine sediment, and then those sediments must survive 500,000 years of subsequent ice ages, erosion, and geological upheaval, only to be discovered by the right person at the right time. It's a lottery with almost impossible odds. And yet, on very rare occasions, the lottery pays out. Not in a dramatic cave burial, but in the noisy, unglamorous setting of a commercial gravel quarry in Swanscombe, Kent, overlooking what was once the ancient floodplain of the River Thames. Here in the 1930s, amongst the churning machinery and piles of aggregate destined for concrete, the river began to give up its greatest secret. It wasn't a team of dedicated scientists who made the first discovery, but an eagle-eyed local dentist and amateur fossil hunter named Alvin Marston. On a summer's day in 1935, sifting through the gravels of Barnfield Pit, he found a piece of bone. It wasn't from a horse or an elephant. It was thicker, more robust. He recognized it immediately for what it was: the occipital bone from the back of a hominin skull. It was an astonishing find, a piece of a person from the deep past. The very next year, incredibly, a second piece was found just a few yards away. The left parietal, the plate of bone that forms the upper left side of the cranium. The two pieces fitted together perfectly. The world of paleoanthropology was electrified. But then the Second World War intervened, and the search was put on hold. For nearly 20 years, the incomplete skull of this ancient individual was all we had. Then, in 1955, after quarrying had resumed, a third and final piece emerged: the right parietal. It, too, was a perfect fit. Over the span of 2 decades, a single human cranium had been reassembled from the ancient gravels of the Thames. This is the Swanscombe skull, the partial remains of a young adult, probably a woman, who lived and died here around 400,000 years ago, a contemporary of the Boxgrove butchers. Her brain was large, around 1,825 cubic centimeters, easily within the range of modern humans, and a significant increase over earlier hominins. The bones themselves are thick and robust, a hallmark of this ancient lineage. But it is what is missing that makes the Swanscombe skull so profoundly important and so endlessly mysterious. We have the back and the top of her head, a smooth, rounded vault that is, in some ways, surprisingly modern. What we do not have is her face. There is no forehead, no brow ridge, no jaw, no teeth. And in the quest to understand the tangled story of human evolution in Europe, the shape of that missing face is everything. This is where a simple fossil becomes the centerpiece of a major scientific debate. The mainstream consensus is that Homo heidelbergensis, the species to which Swanscombe woman belongs, was the direct ancestor of the Neanderthals. Fossils from other sites in Europe, particularly the incredible collection from the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones in Spain, seem to confirm this. The Cima skulls, which are roughly the same age as Swanscombe, already show clear, incipiently Neanderthal features. They have the beginnings of the heavy, double-arched brow ridge, the projecting mid-face, and other telltale characteristics that would become the classic Neanderthal look. According to a theory known as the accretion model, Neanderthal traits didn't appear all at once, but were acquired gradually, piecemeal, over hundreds of thousands of years. This model suggests that the first features to change were in the face and jaw, perhaps related to adaptations for powerful biting and using the front teeth as a kind of built-in toolkit. The brain case, meanwhile, remained more primitive and took longer to evolve its final Neanderthal shape. If this model is correct, then the missing face of Swanscombe woman would almost certainly have possessed these same early Neanderthal characteristics. A rounded, modern-looking brain case would simply represent the ancestral condition, the part of the skull that had not yet begun to specialize. But here is the tantalizing mystery. What if it didn't? What if the Heidelbergensis population in Britain was a little different from their Spanish cousins? Britain was, after all, on the far northwestern periphery of the human world, a peninsula that was periodically isolated by environmental changes. Could this population have been on a slightly different evolutionary trajectory? Could they represent a more generalized form of Heidelbergensis, a branch of the family tree that perhaps wasn't on the direct line to Neanderthals at all, but was instead an evolutionary dead end? Without the face, we simply cannot know. The Swanscombe skull is a Rorschach test in bone. We can project our theories onto it, but its silent, incomplete form offers no definitive answers. It remains a profound and humbling reminder of how little we truly know. It is not an artifact or a tool, but the remnant of a person, a young woman who drank from an ancient river, who perhaps saw the great, straight-tusked elephants moving through the trees, and whose partial remains have left us with one of the most enduring question marks in human history. The world of the Swanscombe woman, like the world of the Happisburg pioneers before her, was built on borrowed time. The Hoxnean interglacial, that long, lush summer of the deep past, could not last forever. The same celestial mechanics that had melted the great Anglian ice sheet were, with imperceptible slowness, beginning to favor the cold once more. The change would not have been obvious in a single lifetime. It would have been a story told by grandparents to their grandchildren, a tale of how the winters seemed to be getting longer, the summers cooler and shorter. The dense, closed canopy of oak and elm would have begun to thin out, the trees struggling to set seed in the abbreviated growing seasons. The landscape would have grown paler, opener, as the temperate forest retreated southwards, replaced by the hardier, more Spartan vegetation of the subarctic. Birch, pine, and eventually the vast grassy plains of the steppe and tundra. For the great animals of the Hoxnean, this was a profound crisis. The straight-tusked elephants and hippos, creatures of warmth and abundant vegetation, vanished from the British record, driven south or into local extinction. And for the hominins, the master butchers of Boxgrove, this environmental decay meant their world was ending. The reliable herds of giant deer and horses grew scarce, and the very land that sustained them was becoming inhospitable. Once again, the human story in Britain came to a close. Homo heidelbergensis packed up and left. They retreated south and east, back onto the great European mainland, abandoning the British peninsula to the encroaching cold. Another glaciation was descending, a series of punishing cold stages that, while not as utterly devastating as the Anglian, were more than enough to render Britain uninhabitable. Ice caps grew again over the Scottish Highlands and Wales, and smaller glaciers pushed down into the English Midlands. The land became a polar desert, a windswept, treeless wasteland, lashed by bitter winds and locked in permafrost. And so, the silence returned. For another 50,000 years or more, Britain was once again an empty stage, devoid of any human presence. The cycle of occupation and abandonment, a rhythm that defines the entire Paleolithic history of this land, had completed another turn. When the climate warmed again, beginning around 300,000 years ago, life returned. The ice retreated, the rivers flowed, and the grasslands and woodlands spread northwards once more. And across the land bridge, human pioneers followed. But these were not the same people who had left. In their long exile on the European continent, the descendants of Homo heidelbergensis had continued to evolve. The subtle, incipient features hinted at in the cima de los huesos skulls had become pronounced, fully formed. The newcomers, who now walked into the reborn British landscape, were a new species, perfectly adapted to the harsh, fluctuating climates of Ice Age Europe. They were shorter and more powerfully built than the people of Boxgrove, with thick, heavy bones and a barrel-shaped chest that was an efficient furnace for warming the cold air they breathed. Their faces were dominated by a large, projecting nose and a heavy, arching brow ridge that sat above wide, deep-set eyes. And inside their long, low cranium was a brain that was, on average, even larger than our own. These were the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. They were not brutish, shuffling cavemen, but highly intelligent, immensely capable survivors who would come to dominate Europe and Western Asia for the next 250,000 years. And in Britain, they would become the longest-serving human residents in its entire history. Their arrival heralded not just a biological, but also a technological revolution. They brought with them a new way of thinking about stone, a sophisticated method of tool production known as the Mousterian industry, centered on an ingenious process called the Levallois technique. The old Acheulean hand axe, remember, was a core tool. The flint knapper took a large nodule and chipped away at it until the core itself became the desired implement. The Levallois technique was fundamentally different. It was a prepared core technology. The napper would take a flint nodule and meticulously shape it, flaking it around the edges and across its surface in a predetermined sequence. They weren't shaping the final tool. They were preparing the core as if it were a mold. All this effort was focused on a single moment, one final, decisive strike at a prepared platform on the edge of the core. If done correctly, this strike would attach a single, perfect flake with a predetermined shape, a sharp triangular point, a broad oval flake, or a long, elegant blade. This leap in conceptual thought is difficult to overstate. It requires the napper to hold a perfect, three-dimensional image of the desired final product in their mind's eye before they even begin, and then to execute a complex and unforgiving sequence of actions to achieve it. It is an act of profound foresight. The core itself was not the goal. It was the means to an end, a source of high-quality, standardized blanks that could then be used as is or lightly retouched into specialized tools. Spear points, knives for butchery, and scrapers for working hides, where the hand axe was a general-purpose tool. The Mousterian toolkit was a suite of specialized implements, a sign of increasing complexity in their behavior. This brings us to the quiet historiographical debate that simmers beneath our understanding of the Neanderthals. For over a century, they were seen as our intellectual inferiors, a primitive dead end. Yet the evidence of the Levallois technique presents a powerful counterargument. Could a being without complex language, without the ability for abstract thought and multi-stage planning, invent and perfectly execute such a process? It seems unlikely. It forces us to confront the possibility that the Neanderthal mind was not lesser than our own, but perhaps just different. A brilliant alternative form of human consciousness, owned by the relentless pressures of the Ice Age. Their first significant appearance in Britain, at sites like Baker's Hole in Kent, where hundreds of these perfect Levallois flakes have been found, marks the beginning of a long and successful dynasty. They were not just visiting, they had come home. The Neanderthals, with their sophisticated Levallois toolkit and their robust, cold-adapted bodies, had established themselves in a Britain that was slowly recovering from the last freeze. They were masters of the cool steppe, expert hunters of horse and bison. But the world they had settled in was not a static one. The climatic warming that had allowed them to return did not simply level off into a pleasant, temperate state. It kept going. The planetary thermostat, nudged by those inexorable orbital cycles, was cranked up high, ushering in an interglacial of astonishing warmth and fecundity known as the Ipswichian, lasting from roughly 130,000 to 115,000 years ago. This period was significantly warmer and wetter than our present-day climate. The evidence for this comes not from dramatic fossils, but from the microscopic testimony of ancient pollen preserved in lakebed sediments. The pollen tells a story of a profound botanical shift, of a landscape transformed into a dense, almost jungly, temperate rainforest. The pioneering birch and pine forests were utterly suppressed, replaced by a thick, closed canopy of deciduous trees. Hornbeam, a tree that today thrives in the warmest parts of southern England, formed vast, dark woods alongside oak, hazel, and elm. The air in summer would have been thick and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves buzzing with insects. Wild grapevines would have twined up the trees, a sight we associate more with the sun-drenched hills of France or Italy than the river valleys of the English Midlands. And it is this transformation of the landscape that sets the stage for the return of an animal so seemingly out of place that its presence forces a complete re-evaluation of what ancient Britain could be. For deep in the river systems, wallowing in the slow-moving, muddy waters of the ancient River Thames, were herds of hippopotamuses. This is not a fanciful reconstruction. It is a paleontological fact. The bones of Hippopotamus amphibius, the very same species we see in Africa today, have been dredged from the gravels beneath Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, alongside the remains of the lions that preyed on them. This single startling image of hippos in the Thames throws the world of the Ipswichian Neanderthals into sharp, almost surreal focus. Their environment was not the cool northern landscape we might imagine. It was, for a few millennia, a place with a climate perhaps more akin to the coastal Mediterranean or even parts of southern Africa. And the hippos were not alone. The great straight-tusked elephants, last seen in the Hoxnean, returned in great numbers, their bulk crashing through the thick undergrowth. Herds of fallow deer, a species that thrives in warm woodland, were abundant. The narrow-nosed rhinoceros browsed the glades, and in the rivers, alongside the hippos, giant beavers built their dams. It was a world teeming with life, a hunter's paradise in one sense, but also a more challenging environment. Remember, the Neanderthals had evolved as hunters of the open plains, where prey could be spotted from a distance and tracked over long journeys. Hunting in a dense, closed canopy forest is a different game entirely. It is a world of shadows, of ambush, of close-quarters encounters. And here we come to the great, whispering mystery of the Ipswichian. The geological deposits from this period are rich with the bones of these warmth-loving animals. We find their remains in old river channels and sinkholes all across southern Britain. Yet, for all this evidence of a thriving ecosystem, the evidence for the Neanderthals themselves becomes strangely elusive, particularly during the climatic peak of the interglacial. We find their distinctive Levallois flakes and tools at sites from the beginning of the period, and again towards the end of it. But from that central phase, when the forests were at their thickest and the hippos were at their happiest, the human signal seems to fade almost to nothing. Why? Why, in what seems to be a time of greatest abundance, do the people become ghosts in their own land? One compelling hypothesis is that the environment, which seems so idyllic to us, was actually a much tougher proposition for them. The dense forest, with its thick undergrowth, may have made their traditional hunting strategies ineffective. It was harder to see, harder to move, and harder to track large animals. Perhaps the very success of the forest drove the large herd-dwelling animals they preferred into smaller, more scattered groups, making the hunt less reliable. In this scenario, the Neanderthal population may have thinned out dramatically, clinging on in small numbers around the coastal fringes or in more open river valleys. Or perhaps they even abandoned Britain altogether for a few thousand years, retreating to the more open landscapes of continental Europe. It's a classic case of not being able to see the wood for the trees. The forest itself may have been the problem. Another possibility is that this is simply a problem of preservation. The peak of the Ipswichian saw global sea levels rise to be perhaps 6 meters or 20 feet higher than they are today. This would have flooded vast areas of what was then the coastline and the lower river valleys, precisely the kinds of resource-rich places where people would have been most likely to live. The archaeological sites from the best part of the Ipswichian might now be sitting on the seabed, miles out in the English Channel, lost to us forever. What we are left with is a frustratingly incomplete picture, a stage set for a thriving human population, but with the actors mysteriously absent from the main scene. We have their tools, and we have the bones of the animals they occasionally hunted, like the single horse vertebra with a Levallois point embedded in it, found at a site in Wales. But the vibrant populous world of the Neanderthals during Britain's subtropical phase remains a puzzle, a warm, green, and silent chapter in their long reign. The strange subtropical interlude of the Ipswichian could not hold. As the world cooled once more, the dense hornbeam forests thinned and retreated, the wild vines withered, and the last of the hippos vanished from the Thames, leaving only their bones in the river gravels as a baffling clue for a future species to uncover. For the Neanderthals, this return to a cooler, more open environment was not a crisis, but a homecoming. The shadowy, closed canopy woodlands that may have hampered their hunting style gave way to a familiar mosaic of parkland, grassy steppe, and coniferous forest. The great herds of horse, of bison, and of the newly arrived woolly rhinoceros and mammoth returned to the plains of Britain. This was the world the Neanderthals were built for, and for the next 60,000 years, they would be its undisputed masters, their lives a testament to a kind of resilience and raw courage that is difficult for us, in our centrally heated world, to truly comprehend. To understand the Neanderthals is to understand the hunt, for it was the absolute center of their existence. Everything about them, from their physique to their technology, was honed for the task of acquiring meat in a hostile, dangerous world. Look at their skeletons. The bones are thick-walled and dense. The muscle attachment points are enormous, indicating a physical strength that would have been astounding by modern standards. Their stocky, barrel-chested build conserved heat, while their powerful limbs were built for explosive bursts of power rather than long-distance running. They were not marathon runners. They were ambush predators, the heavyweights of the human family, and their primary weapon was a reflection of this strength. A heavy wooden spear, tipped with a lethally sharp levallois point, but one that was too heavy and poorly balanced to be thrown any significant distance. This was not a javelin to be hurled from a safe remove. It was a thrusting spear, a killing tool that had to be used up close in the bloody, chaotic space of a direct confrontation. Imagine a small family group, perhaps a dozen individuals, tracking a woolly rhinoceros across the frozen steppe. They are silent, moving with the practiced ease of those who have spent their entire lives reading the landscape. They use the folds in the ground, the sparse cover of birch and willow, to get as close as possible. There is no room for error. The charge comes, a flurry of motion and sound, as they burst from cover, closing the final distance to the great beast. The air is filled with the snorting roar of the rhino, the thud of its hooves on the hard ground, and the Neanderthals are there, right beside it, driving their spears with the full force of their powerful bodies into its flank and underbelly. It is a terrifying, intimate kind of violence. There is the risk of being gored, of being trampled, of being thrown through the air by a swing of the animal's massive head. This was not an occasional act of daring. It was just another Tuesday. It was how they made a living. We know this was their life, because their bones tell the story. The fossil remains of Neanderthals show a pattern of traumatic injury, unlike any other hominin. They have an astonishingly high frequency of healed fractures, particularly to the head, neck, and upper body. When paleoanthropologists compared this injury pattern to databases of modern hospital records, they found the closest match not in soldiers or construction workers, but in professional rodeo riders, people who regularly get thrown and trampled by large, powerful animals. We find skulls with healed fractures from blunt force trauma, collarbones snapped and reset, arms broken, ribs cracked. This was not a gentle existence, but the most important word in that description is healed. These injuries, many of which would have been completely incapacitating, were not death sentences. And this simple fact opens a window into the very soul of Neanderthal society. A hunter with a broken leg or a shattered arm cannot hunt. They cannot gather firewood. They cannot defend themselves from a cave lion or a wolf. In a purely survival of the fittest world, they would be left behind, a burden to the group. But the evidence overwhelmingly shows that this is not what happened. Individuals survived for years, sometimes decades, with debilitating injuries. Consider the famous Old Man of Shanidar, a Neanderthal from a cave in Iraq, who survived a crushing blow to the side of his head that would have blinded him in one eye, had a withered and useless right arm, and suffered from severe arthritis. He lived to be an old man by Paleolithic standards, perhaps into his 40s. For this to be possible, someone had to have been caring for him. Someone had to have fed him, protected him, perhaps even chewed his food for him when his teeth wore down. This is not the behavior of a brutish, unfeeling animal. This is evidence of a deep social bond, of empathy, of a community that understood that its strength lay not just in the power of its hunters, but in the reciprocal obligation of care for its weakest members. The perils of the hunt forged a social contract written in compassion, and this brings us to the quiet, lingering mystery of their inner lives. We can see their strength, their skill, and their empathy written in their tools and their bones. But what of their minds? In Britain, as in much of their range during this period, the evidence for what we might call a symbolic life, art, music, elaborate burial with grave goods, is conspicuously absent. They did sometimes bury their dead, but often in simple pits, with little to suggest a complex ceremony or a belief in an afterlife. We find no cave paintings, no carved figurines. This has led to a long and often contentious debate. Were they fundamentally different from us, pragmatic and literal-minded, their consciousness entirely focused on the here and now of survival? Or is it that their symbolic world was expressed in ways that simply do not preserve, in stories told around a fire, in songs, in rituals performed with wood, feathers, and hides that have long since turned to dust? Perhaps we are judging them by our own standards, looking for our own reflection in the deep past and failing to see the intelligence and humanity that was staring us in the face all along. For 60,000 years, these small, tough family groups endured in Britain, their lives a constant balance of violence and compassion, a quiet, enduring saga that played out long before our own species ever saw the island's shores. For 60,000 years, the Neanderthals had held the lease on Britain. They had seen the world warm and cool, seen forests rise and fall, and had adapted their lives to the rhythm of the hunt, their bones scarred with the evidence of their courageous and compassionate lives, became part of the very soil of the land. But no lease lasts forever, and the landlord of the Paleolithic world was the planet's climate, an entity of immense and indifferent power. The celestial clock that had governed every interglacial and every freeze was ticking on, and the long, stable, cool period that the Neanderthals had mastered was drawing to a close. The world was beginning to exhale, and its breath was once again turning to ice. This was the beginning of the Devensian, the last great glaciation, and it would trigger an abandonment of Britain more profound and long-lasting than any that had come before. The change began subtly, as a series of whispers on the wind. It would have manifested as a slow degradation of their world, a gradual souring of the seasons. The summers grew shorter, wetter, and more reluctant, the sun's warmth seeming thin and watery. The winters arrived earlier and lingered longer, with a deeper, more punishing cold that the thickest of fur hides could barely fend off. The permafrost, the permanently frozen subsoil that had always lurked just beneath the surface in the north, began its slow, inexorable creep southwards. The ground underfoot would have become harder, more unforgiving, the familiar landscape of grassland and scattered woodland slowly transforming into a brittle, frozen tundra. The sparse trees, the dwarf birch and willow that provided essential fuel for their fires, began to shrink and vanish, leaving a vast open landscape with nowhere to hide from the relentless soul-stealing wind. For the great animals, the signal was unmistakable. The vast herds of mammoth, woolly rhino, bison, and especially reindeer, which formed the cornerstone of the Neanderthal diet, were creatures of the steppe. But even they had their limits. As their food source, the rich grasses and sedges dwindled, replaced by sparse, unappetizing mosses and lichens. The herds began to shift their ancient migration routes. They moved south, ever south, following the retreating line of viable pasture land back towards the Great Plains of mainland Europe. And the Neanderthals, whose entire existence was woven into the movements of these animals, had no choice but to follow. Their departure from Britain was not a panicked flight, but a strategic retreat, a slow, generational abandonment of a territory that was ceasing to be a home and was becoming a death trap. Each successive family group would have found the hunting a little harder, the winters a little colder, until the logic became inescapable. The land was dying, and it was time to leave. As the Neanderthals retreated, the ice advanced. High in the mountains of Scotland, Scandinavia, and North Wales, the snows of the short summers no longer melted, accumulating year on year, compressing into ice and beginning to flow outwards and downwards. Great valley glaciers ground their way towards the lowlands, merging into a vast, cohesive ice sheet that began its slow, grinding march south. At its peak, this Devensian ice sheet would not be quite as extensive as the cataclysmic Anglian glaciation of 500,000 years earlier. But it was a formidable force nonetheless. It would eventually cover all of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and push down into England as far as the Midlands, reaching a line from the Wash to the Bristol Channel. The rest of southern England was not glaciated, but this was no reprieve. It became a polar desert, a vast expanse of frozen tundra, subject to ferocious katabatic winds blasting off the face of the ice sheet. It was a sterile, utterly inhospitable landscape, a British Antarctica. And here lies a quiet and haunting mystery. We speak of this retreat as if it were a single, orderly withdrawal. But was it? The climate of the Ice Age was not a smooth, linear decline. It was a chaotic, stuttering process, punctuated by sudden, terrifying cold snaps, known as Heinrich events, where vast armadas of icebergs would break off from the ice sheets and flood the North Atlantic, dramatically disrupting ocean currents and plunging Europe into deep freeze conditions in the space of a few decades. Could a Neanderthal group have been caught out by such a sudden shift, their escape route to the continent cut off by a newly frozen sea or a rapidly advancing glacier? The archaeological evidence is sparse, but some finds of Neanderthal tools have been dated to remarkably late periods, close to the edge of what seems habitable. This has led to the hypothesis of cryptic refugia, tiny, isolated pockets of survivability, where a few last, incredibly hardy bands might have clung on for a few centuries or even millennia after the main population had left. Perhaps a sheltered valley in the southwest, warmed by a quirk of ocean currents, or a coastal plain rich in hardy shellfish. We search for these last ghosts, the final Neanderthal witnesses to Britain's descent into ice. But their traces are faint, almost imperceptible. The overwhelming story is one of absence. By around 60,000 years ago, the lights went out. The last fires were extinguished. The last voices fell silent. Britain was empty once more, entering a period of profound and utter silence that would last longer than the entire recorded history of civilization. The last Neanderthal family group had turned their backs on the whitening shores of the British Peninsula. their footprints quickly erased by the scouring wind. The smoke from their final fire had long since dispersed into the grey, indifferent sky. And then a silence fell. This was not the quiet of a sleeping forest or the hush of a winter's night. It was a silence of geology, a deep, resonant emptiness that settled over the land and would not lift for a span of time so vast it mocks the very concept of human memory. For what followed was not a brief interlude or a temporary setback. It was the long silence, the most profound and sustained period of human absence in the entire million-year story of this land. The world of the Neanderthals was not just paused. It was put into a deep, cryogenic storage, a state of suspended animation under the immense weight of the Devensian ice. To picture Britain during this period is to picture two distinct but equally hostile worlds. In the north, the great ice sheet held dominion. This was not a pristine, beautiful sheet of white. It was a churning, groaning, filthy engine of planetary change. Its surface would have been a chaotic landscape of deep, blue-shadowed crevices, jagged ice pinnacles, and meltwater streams that vanished into terrifyingly deep holes called moulins. Its immense weight had pushed down the land, and its slow, grinding movement southwards had scraped the entire northern half of the island clean, scouring it down to the bedrock, erasing mountains, and carving the deep, U-shaped valleys that would one day become the Scottish Lochs. This was a place of constant noise and movement, the deep internal groaning of the ice, a bass note that never ceased, punctuated by the sharp crack of fracturing ice and the roar of meltwater. It was a landscape in a state of perpetual slow-motion violence. But it is the south, the unglaciated part of Britain, that perhaps paints an even bleaker picture of uninhabitability. This was not a refuge. This was a polar desert. The proximity of the towering ice front to the north created a brutal, localized climate. Ferocious katabatic winds, dense with super-chilled air, would have perpetually blasted off the face of the ice, racing south across the exposed land. Nothing could grow in such a wind. The ground was locked in a deep and ancient permafrost, frozen solid for hundreds of feet down. In the brief, pathetic summer, only the top few inches would thaw, creating a landscape of utter misery, a vast, unstable swamp of freezing mud and waterlogged soil called the active layer. The constant freezing and thawing of this layer churned the ground, sorting the stones into strange, geometric patterns, polygons and stripes that are the telltale signature of a periglacial world. There was no true soil, only a sterile mix of rock fragments and clay. Life here was reduced to its most tenacious and microscopic forms, a few hardy lichens clinging to the wind-blasted rocks, some algae staining the summer meltwater pools. It was a world of grey and brown, a landscape stripped of all color and all warmth, a British Antarctica. And so, the millennia bled into one another, unmarked and unobserved by any human eye. 1,000 years passed, 10,000. The pyramids of Egypt are about 5,000 years old. The entirety of recorded human history, from the first cuneiform tablets to the screen you are looking at now, fits comfortably within that span. Now, imagine 24 of those periods, laid end to end. That is the scale of this silence. 120,000 years. Generations of Neanderthals lived and died on the European mainland, their own world fluctuating with the advances and retreats of the continental ice sheets. Entire species evolved and went extinct, And all the while, Britain lay silent, a frozen, empty appendage on the edge of the world, a land without a story. But here, in the vastness of this emptiness, lies our quiet, persistent mystery. The Devonian glaciation was not one single, monolithic block of cold. The climate record, drilled from the deep ice cores of Greenland, shows that it was a wildly unstable time, punctuated by a series of relatively brief, milder spells known as interstadials. These were not true interglacials. The great ice sheets did not vanish, but for periods lasting a few centuries or a couple of millennia, the temperature would have risen significantly. The pollen record confirms that during the warmest of these blips, the tundra may have briefly given way to sparse birch woodland, and small herds of reindeer or horse may have tentatively ventured back across the plains from Europe. The question that haunts archaeologists is a simple one. Did the Neanderthals ever try to come back? During these brief thaws, Britain would have once again become, at least in theory, habitable. The journey across the dry plains of the North Sea would have been possible. So why do we find no trace of them? We have no Levallois flakes, no butchered bones, nothing to suggest a Neanderthal presence in Britain for this entire vast stretch of time. Is it truly because they never returned, that the memory of Britain as a viable homeland had been lost, or that the route was somehow still too perilous? Or is it the most frustrating problem in all of archaeology, that we simply haven't found the evidence yet? Any such resettlement would have been fleeting, the populations tiny. The tools they left behind might have been scattered by the churning of the permafrost, or scoured away by the subsequent re-advance of the ice. We are searching for a needle in a geological haystack, for the ghosts of a people who might have made one last, failed attempt to reclaim their ancient home, only to be driven out again by the returning cold. For now, the verdict of the evidence is absolute. For over 100,000 years, the human story of Britain is a blank page. That great blank page, the 120,000 years of silence, was not, it turns out, entirely empty. Towards the very end of that immense span of time, a final faint sentence was written, a brief and poignant postscript to the long saga of the Neanderthals in Britain. Around 65,000 years ago, the relentless cold of the Devonian glaciation faltered. It did not break, but it eased its grip, granting the world a temporary, grudging reprieve. This was not a full-blown interglacial like the warm, hippo-haunted Ipswichian. It was an interstadial, a geological stutter, a few millennia of milder conditions that were just enough to roll back the edge of the abyss. The great ice sheet to the north paused its advance and perhaps retreated a few miles. The permafrost that had locked the south in its sterile grip thawed a little deeper, allowing a thin, fragile carpet of vegetation to return. The polar desert blushed with a hint of green as tough grasses, sedges, and mosses recolonized the barren ground, and in the more sheltered river valleys, stands of hardy dwarf birch and willow took root, their skeletal forms a welcome sight in the vast open landscape. This meager improvement was enough. The great herds of the cold steppe, the mammoths, woolly rhinos, and reindeer, ever sensitive to the shifting boundaries of their pasture lands, began to drift north and west once more, venturing back across the wide, dry plain of Doggerland and onto the newly viable British peninsula. And in their footsteps, inevitably, came their hunters. After an absence of more than 50 millennia, the Neanderthals returned. It is hard to imagine what this land must have looked like to them. If any ancestral memory remained, it would have been of a far richer, more wooded world. The Britain they now entered was a harsh, marginal, and profoundly empty place, a vast, windswept prairie, stretching to a horizon broken only by the distant, shimmering wall of the northern ice. It would have been a land of immense skies and a biting, persistent wind, a place where survival depended entirely on the location of the next herd. They brought with them a toolkit, that is, for archaeologists, a fascinating puzzle. It was a late variant of their Mousterian culture, but with a curious feature. Alongside the sophisticated Levallois points and flakes, they were also making small, beautifully crafted hand axes, a tool more associated with their distant Homo heidelbergensis ancestors. This industry, known as the Mousterian of Acheulean tradition, or MTA, represents a strange technological echo from the deep past. And the best evidence for this final, fleeting Neanderthal presence comes from a site that perfectly encapsulates their world. A gravel pit at Linford in Norfolk. Here, around 65,000 years ago, was a shallow, stagnant river channel, a place where a small Neanderthal group had established a hunting camp. And what they were hunting was the biggest game of all, woolly mammoths. The remains of at least 11 individual mammoths were found here, their bones concentrated in a way that suggests this was a favored, repeatedly used butchery station. And scattered amongst the great, fossilized bones were their tools. Dozens of the distinctive MTA hand axes and flakes, many still bearing the microscopic traces of animal tissue on their sharp edges. This site offers a precious frozen moment, a glimpse into their last stand. We can imagine the scene, the small band of hunters, perhaps working together to drive a young or weakened mammoth into the sticky mud of the river channel, where its movement would be hampered. Then, the dangerous close quarters, work with their heavy spears, followed by the immense task of processing the colossal carcass. They used their small, sharp hand axes as precision butchery tools, slicing through the thick frozen hide and dismembering the joints, their hands and faces slick with blood and fat in the freezing air, the wind tearing at their fur cloaks. This was not a land of easy living. It was a life lived on the absolute edge of possibility. And this brings us to the quiet, unresolved mystery of this final chapter. Why the return of the hand axe? Was the MTA toolkit a practical adaptation? The Neanderthals realizing that the versatile, robust hand axe was simply a better tool for the heavy-duty work of processing frozen mammoth carcasses than their more delicate Levallois flakes? Or does it represent something deeper? At this time on the continent, new human groups, anatomically modern humans, were beginning to expand, bringing with them their own distinct cultures. Could the MTA be a sign of Neanderthal societies in flux, their traditions changing as they came into contact with these newcomers, or as their own populations became smaller and more isolated? The more profound question is about the nature of this final settlement. Was it a confident, thriving recolonization, a reassertion of their ancient claim to this land? Or was it something more desperate? The last gasp of a people already in terminal decline across their entire European range, their populations stretched thin, their genetic diversity dwindling. Were the hunters of Linford a robust outpost of a healthy species? Or were they a tiny, isolated group of survivors, clinging to the northernmost edge of their dying world? The evidence is too sparse to say. All we know is that their presence was incredibly brief. The false spring of the interstadial did not last. The climate began to deteriorate once more, the ice re-advanced, and the herds retreated south for the last time. And with them, the last Neanderthals of Britain packed up their tools, abandoned their mammoth kills, and walked away. This time there would be no return. Their story in this land was over, forever. The last Neanderthals had walked off the stage, their footsteps fading into the geological noise of an advancing ice age. The curtain had fallen, and Britain was once again a silent theater, a land without a human story. But elsewhere, far to the south and east, a new human drama was already well underway. On the plains of Africa, a different kind of person had evolved, a species that would ultimately inherit the entire planet. They were taller and more slender than the Neanderthals, their bodies built not for short bursts of power but for endurance, for covering vast distances with a loping, efficient stride. Their skulls were different too, high and domed, with a flat face tucked beneath a vertical forehead and a pronounced, bony chin. Their minds, housed within that globular cranium, seemed to have been wired in a new way, capable of a kind of symbolic and networked thought that would change the world forever. They were, to all intents and purposes, us. They were Homo sapiens. For tens of thousands of years, they had been expanding their range out of Africa, moving across the Middle East and into Asia. When they finally entered Europe around 45,000 years ago, they encountered the Neanderthals, their long-lost cousins. For a few millennia, the two kinds of human shared the continent, a period of interaction and competition that remains one of the most fascinating and poorly understood chapters in our entire history. But these newcomers were not interested in sharing. They possessed a cultural and technological dynamism that seemed to give them a decisive edge. And so, as the Neanderthal populations dwindled towards extinction, these new people, our direct ancestors, pushed ever onwards, exploring every river valley, every mountain range, every last corner of the continent. And eventually, they came to the edge of the great northern plain and saw on the horizon the low, chalky hills of the British Peninsula. Sometime around 40,000 years ago, one of these small bands of modern human pioneers crossed the cold, dry riverbed that would one day become the English Channel and set foot in Britain. The land they found was cold, open, and demanding, but it was not the sterile polar desert it had been during the deepest freezes. This was another of those brief, mild interstadials. The ice sheets had pulled back a little, and the landscape was a vast, rolling steppe tundra, a sea of grass teeming with the great herds of the Ice Age. Reindeer, horse, bison, and the last of the mammoths. For these new people, who had honed their skills on the great plains of Europe, this was a land of immense opportunity, and they came equipped with a revolutionary way of life and a toolkit that made the Neanderthals' Mousterian industry look profoundly antiquated. This was the culture of the Aurignacian, and its foundation was the blade. Remember the Neanderthals' Levallois technique, that ingenious but laborious method of preparing a core to strike a single, perfect flake. These new people had perfected a far more efficient system. They took a large cylindrical flint nodule and prepared it not to remove one flake, but to peel off dozens of long, thin, parallel-sided blades, like shelling peas from a pod. A single flint core, using this prismatic blade technique, could produce a staggering amount of cutting edge, many times more than the most skilled Neanderthal could ever achieve. These blades were the starting point, the blank canvases for an entire new suite of specialized tools. They could be snapped into sections to make arrowheads and spear barbs. They could be shaped into sharp-pointed burins, engraving tools used for working other materials. And this is the second great innovation they brought with them, a mastery not just of stone, but of bone, antler, and ivory. They used their burins to carve and shape these organic materials into deadly new forms. Fine, sharp spear points with split bases for hafting, and most remarkably of all, eyed needles. The simple, humble bone needle may be one of the most significant inventions in human history. It meant the ability to create tailored, multi-layered clothing, fur garments sewn tightly together to provide an unparalleled level of insulation against the cold. It was a technological solution to a biological problem, allowing these gracile African-evolved bodies to thrive in the harshest of Ice Age climates. So the stage is set. We have the new people, the new technology, and the new, albeit temporary, opportunity. But when we look for the hard evidence of this first pioneering arrival, the story becomes incredibly murky. The evidence is so slight, so ephemeral, that it has become the subject of one of the most intense debates in British archaeology. For a long time, the oldest evidence was thought to be the famous Red Lady of Paviland, but that turned out to be much younger. The real focus of the mystery lies in a limestone cave on the Devon coast called Kent's Cavern. Excavated in the 19th century, the cave yielded a treasure trove of Ice Age remains. In 1927, deep in the cave's sediments, a fragment of a human upper jaw, a maxilla containing 3 teeth, was unearthed. For decades, it was assumed to be Neanderthal. But in the 1980s, a re-examination suggested it was from an anatomically modern human. The challenge was to date it. The bone itself was too contaminated for reliable radiocarbon dating, so scientists tried to date the animal bones found in the exact same layer, a wolf and a deer. The results were astonishing, around 41,000 to 44,000 years old. If correct, this small piece of jaw, known as KC4, would be the earliest evidence of our species in all of northwestern Europe. But the mystery deepens. The original excavators were not as meticulous as modern archaeologists. Could the jaw fragment have moved down from a younger layer over time? Is it possible the animal bones used for the dating were not in true association with the human bone? Some researchers have argued just that, suggesting the jaw is thousands of years younger. Others question whether it's even modern human at all, proposing it could belong to a late, unusually gracile Neanderthal. It is a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. We have tantalizing hints, a few other stone tools from the same period found elsewhere, but nothing solid. This first chapter of our own species in Britain is a ghost story. It may have been a brief exploratory flicker of human presence, a single hunting party that stayed for a season and then left, leaving behind only a single disputed fragment of a jawbone. It was not a grand colonization, but a whisper, a tentative footstep into a land that would soon be reclaimed by the ice once more. A land that would have to be discovered all over again. That first tentative visit by our species was indeed just a whisper, a fleeting reconnaissance mission before the returning cold scrubbed the land clean once more. For several thousand years, the silence descended again. But the climatic pendulum of the Devensian was still swinging, and another, more significant mild spell began to dawn around 34,000 years ago. This time, when Homo sapiens returned to the British Peninsula, it was not as a brief exploratory party, but as a confident wave of settlement. These were a people of the Gravettian culture, a sophisticated and widespread tradition of mammoth hunters who dominated the Great Plains of Europe. They brought with them a refined toolkit of slender flint blades and a rich, symbolic world that would leave one of the most astonishing and deeply human monuments of the entire British Paleolithic. To find it, we must travel to the Gower Peninsula in South Wales, to a limestone cave set into a dramatic sea cliff known as Paveland Cave. Today, the mouth of the cave opens to the thunder of the waves, offering a spectacular view of the Bristol Channel. But 33,000 years ago, the scene was unrecognizably different. The sea level was hundreds of feet lower. There was no Bristol Channel, only a wide, cold river valley, miles away in the distance. From the mouth of Paveland Cave, you would have looked out over an immense, windswept coastal plain, a vast grassy steppe stretching as far as the eye could see, a Paleolithic Serengeti of horse, bison, and woolly mammoth. It was here, in 1823, that a man named William Buckland, a geologist, clergyman, and Dean of Westminster, came looking for bones. Buckland was a pioneer of geology, but he was also a man of his time, his scientific mind firmly encased within a biblical worldview. Inside the cave, digging by candlelight, he found something extraordinary, an almost complete human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. And it was stained a deep, dramatic, and unmistakable shade of red. Alongside the skeleton, he found dozens of perforated periwinkle shells and fragments of small ivory rods and a broken ivory bracelet. Buckland, for all his brilliance, was utterly baffled. The very concept of Ice Age humanity was still a fringe and controversial idea. So he reasoned from what he knew. The red staining, he concluded, must have been from the individual's trade. The jewelry suggested a woman. The location, near a Roman encampment, suggested a time period. He put it all together and came to one of the most fantastically wrong, yet wonderfully memorable, conclusions in the history of archaeology. He had found the remains of a Roman-era prostitute or witch, a painted lady who had plied her trade among the soldiers of a nearby fort. He named his discovery the Red Lady of Paveland. And for over a century, that was the story. The truth, when it was finally revealed by the patient work of modern science, was infinitely more profound. In the 20th century, the bones were subjected to radiocarbon dating. The results were a bombshell. The skeleton was not 2,000 years old. It was 33,000 years old. This was not a Roman witch. This was a person from the depths of the last Ice Age, an individual from that second Gravettian wave of settlement. It was, at the time of its dating, the oldest ceremonial burial of an anatomically modern human ever discovered anywhere in Western Europe. And the revelations didn't stop there. More recent analysis of the bones, using the subtle clues of the pelvic structure, proved that the lady was, in fact, a man, a young man, probably in his early 20s, healthy and strongly built. So let us repaint the picture. 33,000 years ago, a young man dies. His people do not simply leave his body to the wolves and the hyenas. They carry him into the shelter of this cave, a place that already held significance, as shown by the many animal bones and tools found there. They dig a shallow grave, and then they perform a ceremony of incredible vibrancy. They cover his body and the entire grave with a massive quantity of red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment that they would have had to grind into a fine crimson powder. He was laid to rest on his side, his head resting on a mammoth skull for a pillow, looking out over that vast lost plain. He was adorned with jewelry, the necklace of periwinkle shells, the bracelets and rods meticulously carved from the ivory of a woolly mammoth. And then they buried him, leaving him to sleep in his red grave. This single burial is a Rosetta Stone for understanding the minds of these people. This was not just about disposing of a body. It was a complex, symbolic act, saturated with meaning. And this brings us to the deep, unanswered questions. What did the ochre mean? This ritual is found across the Paleolithic world, from Spain to Siberia. Was the vibrant red color a symbol of blood, and therefore of life, an attempt to magically reanimate the corpse or to give him vitality in a presumed afterlife? Or was it a preservative, its iron oxide properties, known to have an antibacterial effect? And who was this young man? He was clearly a person of immense importance. The ivory grave goods are the Paleolithic equivalent of being buried with a crown and scepter. They connect him directly to the most powerful and dangerous beast in their world, the mammoth. This was not just decoration. It was a statement of power and prestige. Was he a great hunter, a revered leader, a shaman whose spirit communed with the animal world? The seashells from a coastline that was then many miles away tell us that these people were not isolated. They were part of a wider world of movement and perhaps trade. This young man was part of a dynamic, connected, and symbolically rich culture. The Red Lady, the young man of Paviland, is a vibrant splash of color in a world we too often imagine as a monochrome struggle for survival. He is a testament to the fact that 33,000 years ago, our ancestors were not just surviving. They were thinking, creating, believing, and mourning, wrestling with the same great mysteries of life and death that haunt us to this day. The world of the young man of Paviland, with his ochre-stained bones and his mammoth ivory crown, feels so vibrant, so symbolically rich, that it's easy to imagine it as the beginning of a permanent human story in Britain. It feels like a foundation stone. But it was nothing of the sort. It was a brief, golden autumn before the onset of a winter so profound it would make all previous ice ages seem like mere seasonal chills. The Gravettian people, for all their cultural sophistication, their tailored clothing, and their intricate belief systems, were living on a stage that was about to be violently dismantled. The relatively mild climate that had allowed them to flourish on the mammoth steppe was an illusion, a temporary thaw in a much larger and more powerful cycle of planetary cold. And that cycle was about to reach its terrifying, absolute crescendo. The decline began, as it always did, with the winters. They started to bite a little deeper, to arrive a little earlier, their snows lingering on the ground well into the reluctant spring. The great herds of reindeer and horse, the lifeblood of the Gravettian hunters, became more restless, their migration routes shifting further and further south with each passing generation. For the people, the signs would have been unmistakable. The hunt grew harder. The firewood became scarcer, as the last of the dwarf birch and willow succumbed to the spreading permafrost. The journey to the coast to collect seashells, like those buried with the young man, would have become a longer and more perilous undertaking. They were not ignorant of these changes. Their very survival depended on an intimate, multi-generational understanding of the landscape and its rhythms. And the rhythm they now felt was a funeral dirge. They made the same calculation that the Neanderthals had made before them, and the Heidelbergensis people before them. This land is no longer a home. It is a trap. And so they began to leave. This was not a single, panicked exodus. It was a slow, deliberate, and final withdrawal. Family by family, band by band, they would have packed up their mobile lives, their fur tents, their precious tools, their bone needles, and turned their backs on the British peninsula, following the retreating herds south and east across the vast frozen plain that connected them to mainland Europe. The cave at Paveland, once a place of sacred ritual, fell silent, its red ghost left to stare out at a dying world. The last hunters cast their final spears, their breath pluming in the impossibly cold air. And then, they too were gone. By about 27,000 years ago, the human presence in Britain had dwindled to nothing. The last fire went out, and a silence returned, deeper and more absolute than any that had come before. For what followed was the last glacial maximum, or the LGM. It was the statistical peak of the Ice Age, the moment of maximum cold, maximum ice, and maximum desolation. Over the next few thousand years, the ice sheets that had been growing in the mountains of Scotland and Scandinavia swelled to a monstrous size. The British-Irish ice sheet became a single, cohesive dome of ice, a frozen continent in miniature, stretching from the western isles of Scotland to the coast of Ireland and pushing deep into the heart of England. At its thickest, over the Scottish Highlands, it was more than a mile deep, its sheer weight depressing the earth's crust by hundreds of feet. Its southern edge formed a vast glittering cliff of ice that stretched from the Wash on the east coast, arcing down through the Midlands near modern-day Wolverhampton and across to the Bristol Channel. North of this line, Britain simply ceased to exist. It was a high-domed Arctic wasteland, a landscape of pure, inhuman geometry. Paveland Cave itself was buried deep beneath the ice of a Welsh glacier, and the land to the south of this ice front was no sanctuary. It was the most extreme polar desert the peninsula had ever experienced. The temperature plunged to unimaginable lows, with average annual temperatures perhaps as low as 15 degrees Celsius. The wind that howled off the face of the ice sheet was a constant sand-blasting force, a permanent blizzard of ice crystals and frozen dust that scoured the landscape and made life for any complex organism impossible. The ground was frozen solid for 1,000 feet down. The brief, sunless summers could do nothing more than thaw the top few inches, creating a churning, unstable sludge that would have swallowed any animal that tried to cross it. The landscape was a shattered, sterile vista of frost-cracked rock and battened ground, a world utterly devoid of sustenance or shelter. This was not a place you could visit. It was not a place you could pass through. It was a place where life itself was held in abeyance. This utter bleakness presents us with a quiet but profound historical question. While the consensus is absolute that Britain was completely uninhabitable, the human mind struggles to accept such totality. We look for loopholes, for possibilities. Could there have been a cryptic refugium, a tiny forgotten pocket, where a single, impossibly resilient family group managed to cling on? Geologists sometimes talk of nunataks, the peaks of mountains that stick up through an ice sheet like islands in a frozen sea. Could one of these, a windswept peak in a place like Snowdonia, have harbored some vestige of life? The answer from the climatic data is an unequivocal no. The conditions would have been as hostile as the surface of Mars. The mystery, then, is not if anyone survived, but the sheer crushing finality of the abandonment. It was a complete biological reset. Every plant, every insect, every animal, and every human was either driven out or utterly destroyed. For nearly 10,000 years, from roughly 26,000 to about 17,000 years ago, the land we call Britain was, in every meaningful sense, erased from the book of life, a silent, ice-bound ghost on the edge of a frozen world. The absolute crushing finality of the last glacial maximum seems like an endpoint, a full stop in the human story of Britain. And for the land itself, it was. The peninsula was a sterile, lifeless void, erased from the map of the living, but the story of the people did not end. It simply relocated. The Gravettian hunters who abandoned the cave at Paviland did not march south into oblivion. They retreated onto the very heartland of their world, a place that, for them, was not a bridge or a corridor, but the main stage. We have to adjust our mental map, peel back the blue waters of the North Sea and the English Channel, and see the world as they saw it. Where today there is only grey water and shipping lanes, there was once a country, a vast, low, rolling plain that connected the dead peninsula of Britain to the main continental mass of Europe. This was a world not of coastlines and islands, but of immense, unbroken terrestrial space. We call this lost country Doggerland. It was not a marshy, transient land bridge. It was a territory as large as a modern European nation, a landscape with its own geography, its own ecosystems, its own subtle and demanding character. In the center of what is now the North Sea, the shallow area known as the Dogger Bank was not a submerged sandbank, but a low range of hills, the Dogger Hills, providing a modest height in a world of profound flatness. From these hills, great rivers flowed. The ancient Thames, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt did not find their own separate ways to the sea, but instead converged into a single, colossal river system that flowed south through the heart of Doggerland. This great waterway, sometimes called the Channel River, carved its path down what is now the English Channel, before finally meeting a distant, shrunken Atlantic Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Brittany. The heart of Doggerland was a well-watered plain, a nexus of ancient river valleys, and this entire country was part of the largest single ecosystem on Earth at the time, the Mammoth Steppe. This was a biome that has no modern equivalent, a vast continuous belt of cold, dry grassland that stretched from France across the whole of Eurasia and over the Bering Strait into North America. It was a world of grass and sky. The dominant sensation would have been the wind, a constant, scouring, unimaginably cold wind that blew off the great ice sheets to the north, a wind that never, ever stopped. It was this wind that prevented the growth of forests, keeping the landscape open, and it was this open landscape that supported a biomass of animal life that would have dwarfed the modern Serengeti. Imagine herds of woolly mammoths, their great curved tusks sweeping the thin snow aside to find the frozen grass beneath. Imagine herds of bison and wild horse, tens of thousands strong, their hooves thundering on the permafrost. Imagine vast, flowing rivers of reindeer, their antlers a moving forest, undertaking immense seasonal migrations across this endless plain. And moving among them, the predators, cave lions, wolves, and the humans who had made this harsh, bountiful world their own. These were the descendants of the people of Paveland, their Gravettian culture having evolved into new forms like the Solutrean and later the Magdalenian to cope with the peak cold. They were the ultimate masters of the steppe. Their lives were dictated by the herds. They lived in mobile shelters, likely tents made from stitched animal hides, perhaps weighted down with mammoth bones that could be dismantled and moved at a moment's notice. Their entire existence was a study in mobility, their social networks stretching for hundreds of miles across this open world, connecting scattered family groups through shared hunting grounds and seasonal gatherings. This was not a marginal, desperate existence. For the millennia of the last glacial maximum, Doggerland and the plains of northern Europe were the center of the human universe, a cold, harsh, but incredibly rich and vibrant heartland. Here, of course, is the great, tantalizing mystery of this world. It is gone. Doggerland is a true sunken kingdom, a Paleolithic Atlantis, and our knowledge of it is tragically, achingly incomplete. We cannot go there with a trowel and a brush. Our archaeology comes from the chaotic churn of the seabed, from the nets of fishing trawlers. A Dutch trawler dredging the brown bank pulls up a beautifully worked flint tool, or the fossilized tooth of a mammoth, or, on the rarest of occasions, a human bone. Each find is a single, decontextualized word from a lost library. We have the famous Doggerland spear point, a barbed antler harpoon head, beautifully carved, found by a fishing boat, a testament to the sophisticated hunting technology these people possessed. But how can we reconstruct a world from such fragments? Modern science has given us new eyes. Using seismic survey data from oil and gas exploration, archaeologists have been able to map the coast landscape beneath the waves. They can trace the course of those ancient rivers, identify the shores of a great freshwater lake that once existed in the heart of Doggerland, and map the contours of the lost Dogger Hills. They can take core samples from the seabed and analyze the ancient pollen trapped within, reconstructing the vegetation of this lost world. But this only gives us the stage. The human drama played out upon it remains largely invisible. Was Doggerland merely a transit zone, a vast, empty highway that people crossed to get from Britain to Europe? Or was it, as the evidence seems to suggest, a demographic core, a prime piece of real estate, more densely populated than the surrounding uplands? Could the greatest masterpieces of Ice Age art, the most significant ritual sites, the largest seasonal encampments, all be lying down there in the dark, under hundreds of feet of water and sediment? We may never know. We are left with the image of a thriving, dynamic world, a civilization of the cold, whose people lived and hunted and dreamed on a plain of grass, utterly unaware that the great ice sheets to the north, the very authors of their world, were about to begin melting, and in doing so, would sign the death warrant for their entire country. The great civilization of the Mammoth Steppe, the world of the Doggerland hunters, was a masterpiece sculpted from ice. Its vast, grassy plains existed only because the world's water was locked up in the colossal ice sheets to the north, holding the seas at bay. Its incredible herds of mammoth and bison thrived only in the cold, dry air that blew off those same glaciers. The people who lived there had perfected a way of life in perfect, brutal harmony with the peak of the Ice Age. But the author of their world was also to be its executioner. The same celestial cycles that had plunged the planet into deep cold began with agonizing slowness to turn the thermostat back up. The change started not as a flood, but as a drop of water, a single bead of meltwater on the snout of a glacier, catching the weak light of an Arctic summer. Then another and another, until the drops became trickles, the trickles became torrents, and the torrents became cataclysmic, world-altering floods. The Great Thaw was not a gentle spring. It was a messy, violent, and chaotic affair. The great British-Irish ice sheet, that mile-high dome of ice, began to rot from within. Its surface became a treacherous landscape of meltwater lakes and rivers that bored their way down to the bedrock, lubricating its base. The ice, no longer a solid, stable mass, began to move and fracture, its southern edge retreating not in a neat, orderly line, but in a series of chaotic collapses and surges. Immense, continent-sized lakes of meltwater would build up behind temporary ice dams, only to burst forth in biblical floods known as Jokulhlaups that would scour the emerging land, carving new channels and dumping billions of tons of sand and gravel in their wake. As the ice retreated, the land it left behind was not a green and pleasant place. It was a war zone, a scarred, traumatized, and profoundly alien landscape, still groaning and shifting as it began to rebound from the crushing weight of the ice. It was a world of raw, naked rock, of vast plains of sterile, grey glacial mud, and of immense, stagnant lakes, of milky, freezing water. And for the people of Doggerland, this was an apocalypse in slow motion. The rising sea levels, fed by the melting of the world's glaciers, were the ticking clock on their entire country. With each passing century, the sea nibbled away at the edges of their world. The great Channel River, once a freshwater artery in the heart of their land, began to slow, to widen, to taste of salt as the encroaching Atlantic pushed its way up the valley, turning it into a vast, brackish estuary. The coastline was in constant, bewildering flux. A hunting ground that had been used by a family for generations might, in a single lifetime, become a tidal mudflat, and then a shallow sea. The Mammoth Steppe itself began to die. The climate was becoming warmer, but also wetter. The well-drained, grassy plains that supported the great herds became waterlogged, transforming into boggy, unproductive tundra. The mammoths, those icons of the Ice Age, were under immense stress, their world shrinking, their food source vanishing. Their long reign was coming to an end. The human response to this unfolding catastrophe was not to sit and wait for the waves to close over them. It was to move. As the great ice sheet pulled back from the British Peninsula, it revealed a new land, a ghost of a country returning to the world of the living. And as the herds of reindeer and wild horse, animals better adapted to the new, soggier tundra, moved north into this empty territory, the hunters followed them. Around 16,700 years ago, after an absence of 10 millennia, the first human pioneers once again set foot in Britain. These were the Magdalenians, the direct cultural descendants of the Gravettian people of Paveland. They were the inheritors of a long tradition of Ice Age survival, artists and innovators whose cave paintings at sites like Lascaux in France represent one of the great creative flowerings in human history. They were master hunters, equipped with a sophisticated toolkit of long, elegant flint blades, and most importantly, new projectile technology. They used spear throwers, or atlatls, which acted as an extension of the arm, allowing them to hurl their light, antler-tipped spears with incredible force and accuracy over much greater distances than the Neanderthals ever could. This final recolonization of Britain was shockingly rapid. The archaeological evidence suggests that within a few generations of the land becoming even remotely habitable, people were there. And this raises our quiet mystery. How did they know? Was this a blind expansion, a random stumbling into a new world? Or did they possess a kind of deep memory, an oral tradition passed down for hundreds of generations, a story of a great, game-rich land to the north that had been lost to the ice, a story that prompted them to send out scouting parties as soon as the climate began to shift? The landscape they entered was a blank slate, a raw elemental world of wind, water, and stone. Life was a fragile film on a deeply scarred surface. But it held one great attraction. It was an empty larder. For 10,000 years, no predator had hunted here. The animals that moved into this new land were naive, unwary. For these pioneering Magdalenian hunters, it must have seemed like a paradise of fools, a land of easy meat. They established their first base camps in sheltered, strategic locations that offered a commanding view of the surrounding plains. Places like Creswell Crags, on the border of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, and the Great Cave of Guffs, at the foot of the Cheddar Gorge. From these footholds, they began the last great Paleolithic adventure in Britain, the exploration and settlement of a brand new Old World. Those first pioneering Magdalenian hunters pushing north into the raw, newly thawed landscape would have been drawn to places that offered a natural advantage, and few places in the scarred, empty heart of post-glacial England would have been more advantageous than Creswell Crags. Imagine a deep, winding gorge carved by a meltwater river through a ridge of soft limestone. The river provided water and attracted game. The steep cliffs offered a commanding, defensible view over the surrounding plains where the herds of horse and reindeer would graze. And most importantly, the cliffs were riddled with the dark mouths of caves, natural, ready-made shelters from the relentless wind and the biting cold. For these returning humans, it was the Paleolithic equivalent of a prime piece of real estate, a perfect base camp from which to explore and exploit this new, empty world. And for a long time, that's all we thought it was. A campsite, a butchery station, a place of practical survival. The tools and the animal bones found there told a story of a hard, pragmatic existence. For over a century, archaeologists believed that while their cousins in France and Spain were turning caves like Lascaux and Altamira into sublime painted cathedrals, the people who came to Britain had left all that behind. Their minds focused only on the grim business of staying alive. Britain was an artistic desert, but the secrets of a cave are not always given up easily. Sometimes they wait for the right kind of light. In the early 2000s, a team of archaeologists and prehistorians, armed with powerful modern lamps, went back into the caves at Creswell Crags, specifically into a large chamber known as Church Hole. They weren't looking for paint. They knew the damp British climate would have destroyed any paintings long ago. They were looking for something far more subtle. lying on their backs on the cold cave floor. They shone their lights at a low angle across the rough limestone of the ceiling, a technique called raking light. And as the light skimmed the surface, the faint, almost invisible scratches that had been dismissed for decades as random marks left by ice or rock falls suddenly resolved, as if by magic, into coherent, deliberate images. The random scratch was the powerful, sloping back of a bison, its head lowered, its beard and horns clearly defined. Another set of lines was the elegant, long-necked form of a wild horse. They had found it. After more than 14,000 years of waiting in the dark, the art of Ice Age Britain had finally been seen again. What they uncovered was not a single, isolated doodle, but an entire gallery of engravings, a ghostly zoo of Ice Age animals scratched into the living rock with a sharp flint burin. There are multiple images of stags, their antlers branching across the ceiling. There is what appears to be a graceful, long-necked bird, perhaps a crane or a swan. But it is the bison that commands the space, a powerful, dynamic figure, its bulk and strength captured with a few confident, masterfully executed lines. This was not the work of a novice. The artist who engraved this bison knew the animal intimately, understood its anatomy, its posture, its very essence. And their style was unmistakable. It was a perfect match for the Magdalenian art found hundreds of miles away on the continent. These were not provincial amateurs. These were masters of their craft, carrying their entire artistic and cultural tradition with them into this new land. Creswell Crags was instantly transformed from a mere campsite into the northernmost outpost of Paleolithic creativity in all of Europe, a vital, reconnecting thread to the great artistic heartlands of the Ice Age. And this brings us to the profound mystery that lies at the heart of these engravings. Why were they made? These were not decorative murals for a living room. They are found on the ceiling and high on the walls, often in places that are difficult to see, hidden away from the main living areas of the cave. To see them, and indeed to create them, would have required entering the deep, cold, and absolute darkness of the inner cave, the only light coming from a flickering, sputtering tallow lamp, fueled by burning animal fat. Imagine the scene. The artist, lying on their back, their breath misting in the freezing air, the shadows cast by the unsteady flame, making the rough walls of the cave seem to writhe and move. In this sensory, disorienting environment, the act of engraving the image of a bison onto the rock becomes something more than art. It becomes a ritual. Was it a form of hunting magic, an attempt to capture the spirit of the animal in the rock to ensure success in the hunt outside? Or were these images part of a shamanistic rite? The bison, a spirit animal. The cave, a portal to another world where the shaman would travel in a trance state. The most compelling clue, and the deepest part of the mystery, lies in an engraving of an animal that simply should not be there, an ibex. Its distinctive backward curving horns are unmistakable. But the wild ibex was an animal of the high mountains of southern and central Europe, like the Alps and the Pyrenees. Its bones have never been found in Ice Age Britain. The artist who engraved the ibex at Creswell Crags could not possibly have seen one grazing on the plains of Derbyshire. This means they were not drawing from life. They were drawing from memory. They were carrying in their mind a mental template, a symbolic vocabulary of animals that was part of their cultural inheritance, learned and practiced far away in their continental homeland. The art at Creswell Crags, then, is not just a record of the local fauna. It is a statement of identity, an act of cultural transportation. These pioneers were not just colonizing a new land with their bodies and their tools. They were colonizing it with their minds, with their stories, with their sacred images. They were taking this raw, empty, and alien landscape and making it their own, carving the familiar ghosts of their own world into its very bones, turning a simple cave into a sanctuary, a place of memory and power at the far cold edge of the world. The ethereal images scratched into the ceiling of Church Hole at Creswell Crags open a precious window into the symbolic life of these last Ice Age hunters. They show us a people connected to their world through art and memory, capable of capturing the spiritual essence of the animals they hunted. It is a profoundly human, almost gentle revelation. But the Paleolithic mind was not a simple, monolithic thing. It was as complex, as contradictory, and as capable of darkness as our own. And to understand its other face, we must travel south from the limestone gorge of Derbyshire to an even grander and more dramatic landscape, the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. Here, a great gash in the Mendip Hills reveals cliffs hundreds of feet high, and at their base lies another of the great Magdalenian sites, a vast cavern known as Gough's Cave. Like Creswell, it was a prime location, a sheltered, south-facing cave with a river flowing from its mouth, overlooking a landscape that would have been rich with game. And for thousands of years, archaeologists have been pulling the remains of that game from its floor sediments. The bones of wild horse, of reindeer, of giant deer, all bearing the classic telltale marks of butchery, but scattered among the animal bones, jumbled together with no apparent distinction, were other bones. Bones that were undeniably human. For a long time, their presence was a puzzle. Were these later burials that had been accidentally mixed in with the older animal remains? Or was something else going on? It was only with the advent of modern forensic techniques, the ability to examine bones under powerful microscopes and to date them with pinpoint accuracy, that the horrifying stomach-churning truth began to emerge. The human bones were exactly the same age as the animal bones, around 14,700 years old. They belonged to the same Magdalenian people who had made the art at Creswell Crags, and they had been subjected to the exact same treatment as the carcasses of the wild horses. The evidence is meticulous, unambiguous, and deeply unsettling. We find human skulls, arm bones, and leg bones, with the fine parallel V-shaped cut marks left by sharp flint knives clustered around the major muscle attachments, the signature of systematic defleshing. We find human finger bones with human teeth marks on them, the indentations showing where someone had chewed the flesh from the bone. We find the long bones, the femurs and tibias, not laid out in careful burial, but shattered, deliberately broken open with hammerstones, in the same way one would break a reindeer bone to get at the rich, nutritious marrow inside. The remains belonged to at least 5 individuals, including a young child of about 3 and 2 adolescents. This was not a sacred burial ground. It was a butchery site, and humans were on the menu. This discovery forces us to confront the specter of cannibalism. The word itself is so loaded, so freighted with our deepest taboos, that it can be hard to think about it clearly. The first, most obvious explanation is that of survival. Perhaps this was a time of desperate starvation, a brutal winter when the herds had vanished and the hunters returned to camp empty-handed day after day. In such an extremity, could a group have been forced to consume its own dead to survive? It's a plausible, if grim, scenario. But the evidence at Guff's Cave points towards something far stranger, something more complex and, in a way, more terrifying than a simple act of desperation. The clue lies not in the bones that were shattered, but in the ones that were preserved with meticulous, obsessive care. The skulls. 3 human skulls from the cave had been prepared in a highly unusual and standardized way. First, the scalp and all the soft tissue had been carefully sliced off. Then, using precise controlled blows, the facial bones and the base of the skull were removed. Finally, the ragged edge of the remaining cranial vault was delicately retouched with fine flint flakes, trimming and smoothing it, until the result was a perfectly formed, symmetrical, and quite serviceable bowl or cup, made from the upper part of a human head. These are not the hasty, smashed remnants of a starvation event. They are carefully curated artifacts, crafted with a level of skill and attention to detail that speaks not of desperation, but of tradition. They are ritual objects. This is the heart of the mystery of Guff's Cave. We are not looking at survival cannibalism. We are almost certainly looking at ritual cannibalism. The processing of the human bodies was methodical, following a clear pattern, a butcher's how-to guide that was identical for both a horse and a human. The creation of the skull cups was the final ceremonial step in this process. But what did the ritual mean? This is a question that may never be answered, a whisper from a moral universe that is utterly alien to our own. Was it a form of funerary rite? In some cultures, consuming a part of a deceased loved one, a practice known as endocannibalism, is seen as the highest form of respect, a way of incorporating their spirit and strength into the living community. Could these people have been lovingly and respectfully eating their own dead, drinking from their skulls in a sacred communion? Or was it the opposite? Was this an act of ultimate desecration, a ritual for dealing with enemies, exo-cannibalism? Was this small band of hunters displaying the heads of their vanquished foes, consuming their flesh to absorb their power, and turning their skulls into trophies, a stark and brutal warning to any rivals? The evidence itself is silent on the motive. We cannot know if the individuals consumed were cherished relatives or hated enemies. All we know is that for the people of Guff's Cave, the boundary between a human body and an animal carcass, a line that seems so absolute to us, was permeable, perhaps even non-existent. They were the same people who could look at a blank cave ceiling and see a spirit bison, who could translate the soul of an animal into a few graceful, eternal lines. And they were the same people who could look at a human head and see a cup. This uncomfortable, profound paradox is the legacy of Guff's Cave, a reminder that the minds of our ancestors were not simple, but a complex tapestry of light and darkness, of sublime creativity, and what appears to us as the most brutal of acts. The shadows in Guff's Cave are long and deep, populated by the unsettling ghosts of our own complex nature. It is a place that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our ancestors were capable of both sublime artistry and what we perceive as brutal savagery. But while the human drama played out in these dark, sheltered spaces, A far grander and more final drama was unfolding outside, on the vast, windswept stage of post-glacial Britain. The Magdalenian hunters, for all their intelligence and adaptability, were just one small part of a biological community, an intricate web of life that was beginning to unravel with astonishing speed. They were living through the final act of a pageant that had run for 100,000 years. This was the last dance of the megafauna, the final poignant twilight of the great beasts of the Ice Age. For millennia, the landscape had been dominated by these colossal figures, creatures of a scale and magnificence that defy the modern imagination. Chief among them, an animal so spectacular it seems to have walked from the pages of mythology, was the giant deer, Megaloceros giganteus. Often called the Irish elk, it was neither exclusively Irish nor an elk, but a true deer of monumental proportions, standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, larger than any living moose. But its size was not its most defining feature. That was reserved for its antlers. In a prime bull, the antlers could span 12 feet from tip to tip and weigh nearly 90 pounds. This was the largest and most metabolically expensive headgear in the history of life on Earth. A breathtaking, almost absurd statement of genetic fitness. To see a herd of these creatures moving across the open parkland, their great, palmate antlers held high, would have been to witness a scene of profound and ancient grandeur. Sharing this world was the undisputed icon of the age, the woolly mammoth. We have their bodies, flash frozen in the Siberian permafrost, so we know them with an intimacy we have for no other extinct creature. We know the color of their shaggy reddish-brown coats, the thick layer of fat beneath their skin for insulation, their small fur-lined ears to prevent frostbite. They were social, intelligent animals, living in matriarchal herds, just like modern elephants, the wise old females leading their families across the vast grassy plains. Their great, curving tusks used not just for defense, but for sweeping away the snow to find the frozen vegetation beneath. Alongside them plodded the woolly rhinoceros, a more solitary and perhaps more cantankerous beast. A 2-ton tank of muscle and horn, its head perpetually lowered to graze. And stalking them all was the apex predator, the cave lion, a beast a quarter again as large as a modern African lion, a specialist hunter perfectly adapted to bringing down the young, the old, and the unwary of these giant herds. This was the world the Magdalenians inherited, a world of giants, but it was a world built on a climatic knife edge. The mammoth steppe, that cold, dry grassland that sustained this entire ecosystem, was an artifact of the deep freeze, and the great thaw, the warming period, known as the Billing-Allerud Interstadial, was its death sentence. The rising temperatures were one thing, but the real killer was the moisture. As the glaciers melted, the air grew humid, the rainfall increased, and the well-drained grassy plains began to turn to mush. The nutrient-rich grasses that the mammoths and rhinos depended on were replaced by waterlogged sedges and mosses, a kind of green desert that looked lush but offered poor nutrition. The ground itself became a trap, with bogs and wetlands spreading where once there had been firm permafrost. For a multi-ton mammoth, a bog is a death sentence. And as the ground grew wetter, the trees returned. At first, it was a scattered vanguard of dwarf birch and willow, but soon they were followed by taller, denser stands of birch and pine. The open world began to close in. For the giant deer, This was a catastrophe. Those magnificent 12-foot antlers, such a potent symbol of power on the open plain, became a fatal liability in even a moderately dense woodland, snagging on branches, making escape from predators and movement through the landscape impossible. And so, one by one, the giants began to fail. The archaeological record tells a story of a slow, staggered collapse. The woolly rhino seems to have been the first to go in Britain, then the cave lion, its specialized prey base dwindling, starved into extinction. And finally, the mammoths and the giant deer, their habitats shrinking year by year, their populations becoming smaller, more fragmented, and more vulnerable. This brings us to one of the most hotly contested debates in prehistory. Who or what delivered the final blow? Was it the climate, or was it us? For decades, the overkill hypothesis, championed by Paul Martin, suggested that the arrival of highly skilled human hunters with their deadly projectile weapons was the primary cause of the mass extinction. In this scenario, the Magdalenians were a wave of death, a blitzkrieg of super predators sweeping across the landscape and wiping out animal populations that had no evolutionary defense against such an intelligent and well-armed foe. But the evidence from Britain, and indeed much of Europe, paints a more complex picture. The climatic changes were so profound, the habitat loss so complete, that these animals were almost certainly doomed anyway. Their world was being dismantled around them. However, it seems naive to think that our ancestors played no role. The most likely scenario is a deadly synergy. The climate loaded the gun, putting the megafauna under immense stress and shrinking their numbers. And then the human hunters, targeting the last, isolated herds, effectively pulled the trigger. They were not the sole cause, but the final decisive factor, hunting the last few stragglers into oblivion. For the Magdalenians, their entire culture was based on these animals. They were witnessing the end of their own world too. The last dance of the megafauna was a mournful waltz, its final fading notes a prelude to a profound silence and an even more profound change. The last dance of the megafauna had ended, and the world they left behind felt like a new creation, a planet breathing a sigh of relief after 100,000-year fever. The great thaw of the Billing Alarud interstadial was in full swing, and for the first time in millennia, the world felt gentle. The relentless, scouring wind of the mammoth steppe had softened into a breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and new life. The sterile grey plains of glacial mud were being colonized by a rising tide of green, first with a carpet of hardy grasses and sedges, and then, with astonishing speed, by a pioneering forest of birch, its silver bark a welcome shimmer in the pale northern sun. The rivers, once choked with the milky rock flour of the glaciers, now ran clear over their gravel beds. For the Magdalenian people living through this change, it must have felt like a promise fulfilled, the dawning of a new and permanent age of warmth. Their entire way of life was adapting. The focus shifted from hunting the great, open plain herds of mammoth and bison to stalking the smaller, more solitary game of the emerging woodlands. Red deer, roe deer, the giant elk. They were becoming a people of the forest, their world growing quieter, greener, and seemingly safer. But the planetary systems that govern our climate are not a gentle, linear progression. They are a chaotic, complex machine, a web of interconnected currents and feedback loops, and sometimes a single critical component can fail with a sudden, catastrophic snap. The people of 12,900 years ago were about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. They were standing on a climatic cliff edge and had no idea. The very engine of their warming world, the melting of the great ice sheets, was about to trigger its own undoing. The entire climate of Northern Europe is a gift from the ocean, specifically from a great looping current known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. Think of it as the planet's hot water bottle. Warm, salty water from the tropics flows north, releasing its heat into the atmosphere and keeping places like Britain far warmer than their latitude should allow. As it cools and becomes denser, this water sinks to the deep ocean near Greenland and Iceland, and then flows south again, completing the circuit. For this system to work, the northern water has to be salty enough to sink. But for centuries, the melting ice sheets of North America had been pouring unfathomable volumes of cold, fresh water into the North Atlantic. For a time, the ocean absorbed it, but eventually, a tipping point was reached. The most widely accepted theory is that a colossal glacial lake in North America, known as Lake Agassiz, a body of water larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, finally breached its ice dam. A freshwater flood of almost unimaginable scale, a torrent carrying more water than all the world's rivers combined, burst out into the North Atlantic. This immense, buoyant lens of fresh water spread across the ocean surface, effectively shutting down the amok. The hot water bottle was switched off, and the climatic response was not a gentle cooling over centuries. It happened in the space of a few years, perhaps even a single decade. It was as if a giant invisible hand had reached out and thrown the planet's thermostat violently into reverse. This was the Younger Dryas, a geological snap freeze, a brutal 1,300-year return to the absolute worst conditions of the Ice Age. The birch forests that had taken centuries to grow died in a single generation. The silver trunks left standing like a skeletal army on a newly frozen plain. The permafrost, which had been in retreat, surged southwards again, locking the ground in its iron grip. The glaciers in the Scottish Highlands, which had shrunk to mere remnants, began to grow and advance with terrifying speed, a period known as the Loch Lomond Stadial. The world didn't just cool, it rewound. Britain was plunged back into a state of Arctic tundra, a windswept, treeless wasteland, almost as hostile as it had been at the last glacial maximum. And this shocking reversal leads us to one of the most exciting and controversial mysteries in modern science. While the Lake Agassiz flood is a strong contender for the trigger, another more dramatic hypothesis whispers from the fringes. A growing number of scientists argue that the trigger wasn't a flood, but a cosmic accident. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid exploded in an airburst over the North American ice sheet. The blast would have vaporized a significant amount of ice, injecting vast quantities of water vapor and dust into the atmosphere, destabilizing the climate and triggering the subsequent meltwater pulse. Proponents point to a thin layer in the sediment, from this time containing exotic materials like nanodiamonds and elevated levels of platinum, signatures consistent with an extraterrestrial impact. The debate is fierce, but the possibility is intoxicating that this entire climatic catastrophe was not the result of a terrestrial process, but a direct intervention from outer space. For the small human population of Britain, the cause was irrelevant. The effect was absolute. Their world was utterly destroyed. The forests were gone. The woodland animals they had learned to hunt had vanished, and the very ground beneath their feet had frozen solid. Their resilience was tested not by hardship, but by impossibility. The archaeological record tells the story in what it lacks. After 12,900 years ago, the human signal in Britain, the flint tools, the butchered bones, the campfire hearths, goes almost completely silent. There is a profound and telling emptiness. They did not stay and fight. They did not attempt to endure the unendurable. They made the same heartbreakingly logical choice their ancestors had made time and time again. They left. For at least the third, and perhaps the final time, the British Peninsula was completely abandoned. The promise of a new, warmer world had been a cruel trick, a false dawn. Britain was once again an empty land, a ghost island waiting under a frozen sky for the ice to give up its grip one last time. The long 1300-year winter of the Younger Dryas felt like a final vindictive act of the Ice Age, a brutal and seemingly permanent return to the frozen status quo. The people who had fled Britain had every reason to believe that the brief green promise of the thaw had been a lie, and that the world had locked itself back into its ancient icy rhythm. They retreated to their continental heartlands, to the river valleys of France and Germany, and resigned themselves once more to a life dictated by the tundra. But the great, chaotic engine of the Earth's climate had one last, violent surprise in store. The shutdown of the Atlantic conveyor belt, the very thing that had plunged the world into this deep freeze, was not a permanent failure. The ocean, in its own vast and patient timescale, was rebalancing. The great flood of fresh water from the melting glaciers had dispersed. The salinity of the North Atlantic began to rise again, and somewhere in the deep, dark waters off the coast of Greenland, the great current stirred, and the engine sputtered back to life. The end of the Younger Dryas was not a slow, gentle dawn. It was a flick of a switch. The evidence, drilled from the 2-mile-thick ice sheet of Greenland, is written in layers of ancient snow, and it tells a story of a climate shift so abrupt it borders on the unbelievable. Around 11,750 years ago, in the space of a single human lifetime, perhaps in as little as a couple of decades, the average temperature in the North Atlantic region shot up by as much as 7 degrees Celsius. It was the most dramatic and rapid global warming event in the planet's recent geological history. The 1300-year winter did not fade away. It shattered. The glaciers that had been reborn in the Scottish Highlands, which had been grinding their way down through the lochs, now began to melt with catastrophic speed, hemorrhaging water and ice. And within a few centuries, they had vanished for the last time, leaving behind only the deep U-shaped valleys and the scoured bedrock as their final testament. The Ice Age, after a reign of more than 2.5 million years, was finally, truly over. This final, definitive warming triggered the most profound environmental transformation in Britain's history. It was the birth of the world we know today. The first and most dramatic change was the death of the open plain. The tundra, that vast treeless landscape of sedges and mosses, could not survive the warmth and the rising rainfall. Its death warrant was signed by a single pioneering tree, the birch. Its light, winged seeds were carried on the wind from the European mainland, and they found a fertile bed in the raw, virgin soils left behind by the retreating ice. With no competition, the birch exploded across the landscape. Within a few centuries of the warming, a vast, pale, and airy birch forest had swept northwards, covering almost the entirety of Britain. What had been a world of immense, unbroken horizons, a world of grass and sky, became a world of dappled light and shadow, a world defined by the vertical lines of countless silver trunks. And behind this pioneering vanguard came the next wave. Pine, with its darker foliage and its resinous scent, began to establish itself among the birch. Then came the hazel, its nuts providing a rich new food source. And finally, the true kings of the New Age arrived, the great, broad-leaved hardwoods, oak and elm. They marched north from their glacial refuges in the Balkans and Iberia, their acorns and seeds carried by birds and small mammals, and they began to create the dense, closed canopy, temperate rainforest that would dominate the British landscape for the next 6,000 years. This was the wildwood, a forest so thick and so extensive that a squirrel, it was said, could have traveled from Land's End to John O'Groats without ever touching the ground. This great afforestation was a complete rewriting of the ecological rules. The age of the herd was over. The age of the forest had begun. And into this new, green, and rapidly changing world, humans returned. They were the descendants of the same Magdalenian hunters who had been driven out by the younger Dryas. But they were entering a land their grandparents would not have recognized. They crossed the still existing plains of Doggerland and found not an open prairie, but a burgeoning forest. Their old ways of life, their reliance on tracking vast herds of reindeer across the tundra, were now obsolete. They had to learn to be a new kind of people. And this brings us to a quiet but fascinating debate. How fast did this incredible green wave actually move? The traditional view is of a slow, steady march of trees, advancing a few hundred feet each year. But some recent models suggest it may have been much faster, a blitzkrieg of vegetation with outlier populations of trees established hundreds of miles ahead of the main front by freak winds or animal carriers. The mystery is what, if anything, was holding it back. In a world without mammoths and woolly rhinos to trample and browse the young saplings, what was to stop the forest from becoming a single, unbroken canopy? The answer may have been the very people who were returning to it. These final Paleolithic pioneers may have been the first forest managers. By deliberately setting fires, they could have cleared small areas of the burgeoning woodland, creating open glades that would attract grazing animals like red deer and aurochs, the great wild cattle of Europe. It's a compelling idea that our ancestors were not just passive witnesses to this great change, but active participants, using fire to sculpt the new landscape to their own needs, ensuring that even in this new, closed-in world, there were still pockets of the open plain they understood so well. Their story, however, is a story of transition. They were the last of the Paleolithic, the final hunters of the old world, walking into the dawn of a new one. The last of the Paleolithic hunters, those pioneers who had returned to a world being reborn, found themselves in a strange and rapidly shrinking paradise. For generations, their ancestors had been people of the horizon, their minds shaped by the vast unbroken emptiness of the mammoth steppe, their eyes accustomed to scanning immense distances for the telltale dust cloud of a migrating herd. But now, with every passing year, the horizon was drawing closer. The forest, That great silent green tide of birch and pine was closing in, swallowing the open plains, muffling the world in a cloak of leaves and shadow. The very air was different, no longer the crisp, dry, skewering wind of the Ice Age, but a softer, damper, more intimate atmosphere, heavy with the scent of wet earth, decaying wood, and the resin of the pines. Their entire world was being fundamentally rewritten, and the old ways of life, the old certainties, were turning to dust and leaf mold. This profound environmental shift marks for archaeologists a convenient line in the sand. It is the end of the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and the beginning of a new chapter, the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age. But for the people living through it, it was not a neat and tidy turning of a page. It was a slow, challenging, and deeply creative process of adaptation, a multi-generational struggle to learn how to be human in a world that was no longer built for giants. The old toolkit, the long, elegant flint blades, and the powerful spear thrower of the Magdalenians was a technology perfected for the open plain. The atlatl could hurl a spear with devastating force over 100 yards, a perfect weapon for bringing down a horse or a reindeer in a wide, treeless landscape. But in the dense, tangled undergrowth of the new wildwood, it was a clumsy and ineffective tool. Its long arc was easily deflected by a branch, its killing power wasted in the close-quarters chaos of the forest. The great, consolidated herds were gone, replaced by smaller, more elusive prey. The shy roe deer, the solitary and formidable aurochs, the intelligent and wary wild boar. A new kind of hunting required a new kind of weapon and a new way of thinking about stone. And so began a technological revolution, a move away from the big, single-purpose tool towards something smaller, more versatile, and infinitely more adaptable. This was the age of the microlith. Imagine a master flint knapper, no longer focused on producing a single perfect blade, but on creating tiny, standardized geometric components. With incredible skill, they would produce small, slender blades, and then, using a technique of controlled snapping, they would shape them into minuscule, razor-sharp triangles, crescents, and trapezoids, some no bigger than a little fingernail. These were not tools in themselves. They were the interchangeable parts of a sophisticated new composite technology. These tiny flint chips were set in rows along a groove in a wooden or bone shaft and held in place with birch bark tar, creating the serrated, saw-toothed edge of a knife or the lethally barbed point of a harpoon. But their most important application was as the tip and barbs of a new and revolutionary weapon, one perfectly suited to the silent, shadowy world of the forest, the bow and arrow. The arrow, silent, accurate, and deadly at short range, was the perfect answer to the challenges of woodland hunting. The Mesolithic toolkit was a testament to a new kind of ingenuity, a miniaturization that gave them a flexibility their ancestors could only have dreamed of. This technological shift was mirrored by a profound change in their way of life. They were no longer following the great migrations. Instead, they became masters of a smaller, more intimate territory, their lives tethered to the rich resources of the lake shores, the river valleys, and the newly forming coastlines. Their diet, once heavily focused on a few big game species, diversified into a broad spectrum of resources that would have astonished their ancestors. They were still hunters of red deer and wild boar, but they were now also expert fishermen, using their barbed harpoons to spear pike and eels in the clear rivers. They were fowlers, using their new bows to bring down ducks and swans in the wetlands. And they became expert foragers, gathering the bounty of the forest, vast quantities of hazelnuts, which they would roast and store for the winter, along with berries, roots, and fungi. This new, more settled existence is best captured at a single, miraculous site, Starkar in Yorkshire. Here, on the edge of what was once a vast post-glacial lake, a small Mesolithic community built a settlement. The waterlogged, peaty soil preserved a snapshot of their world with unbelievable clarity. We have the wooden platforms they built out over the reeds, the birch bark rolls they used for containers, even a wooden paddle. The earliest evidence of boat building in Britain, but the most enigmatic and evocative finds from Starkar are the headdresses. Archaeologists have unearthed more than 30 frontlets made from the skulls of red deer, the antlers still attached, the bone carefully scraped clean and perforated, clearly designed to be worn on a human head. And this is the great mystery of these new people of the forest. What were these for? Were they simply elaborate hunting disguises, a practical tool to allow a hunter to creep closer to a herd of deer? Or, as seems more likely, were they the sacred regalia of a shaman, worn during a ritual dance to commune with the deer spirit, to ask its permission for the hunt, to ensure the continuity of the life that now sustained them? To wear the antlered skull of the deer was perhaps to see the world through its eyes, to blur the line between the hunter and the hunted, to become one with the spirit of the wildwood. It suggests a rich, symbolic, and deeply spiritual relationship with their new, forested world. These were a people who had successfully navigated the greatest climate transition in human history. A people who had learned to listen to the whispers of the trees, utterly unaware that the rising waters that lapped at the edge of their lakeside home were part of a much larger, inexorable tide. A tide that was about to change the very nature of their world forever. The people of Starkar, with their antlered headdresses and their lakeside homes, were the masters of a new and burgeoning world. Their lives were intimately woven into the rhythms of the post-glacial lake, into the whispering reeds and the silent movements of the red deer in the birch forest. Their world felt stable, eternal, a landscape finally at peace after the long, violent trauma of the ice. But the water that lapped at the edge of their wooden platforms was not a self-contained, local phenomenon. It was the very fringe of a vast and rising power, the slow, inexorable advance of a global ocean awakening from its long, frozen slumber. The melting of the great ice sheets in North America and Scandinavia was not a distant, abstract event. It was a death sentence, delivered drop by drop, for the very country that defined their existence, the low-lying plain of Doggerland. For thousands of years, this process was a subtle theft, a slow generational retreat. To the Mesolithic people, it would not have been perceived as a single, coherent event called sea level rise. It would have been experienced as a series of local, bewildering changes. A coastal hunting ground, used by a family for generations to track wild boar, would become a salt marsh, then a tidal mudflat, and then, within a single lifetime, a shallow, windswept bay. A freshwater river, a reliable source of pike and eels, would begin to taste of salt, its familiar fish replaced by strange marine species. The ancient, well-trodden pathways that connected communities across the Great Plain would become impassable for longer and longer periods, first during the spring tides and then forever, forcing people to take long, arduous detours or to build the first crude boats to maintain contact with their neighbors. It was an apocalypse in slow motion, a great drowning that unfolded over 200 human generations. As the waters rose, the familiar geography of their world began to dissolve. The great, sprawling river systems that had once flowed through the heart of Doggerland became immense, branching estuaries, their valleys flooded by the encroaching North Sea. The low hills in the center of the plain, the place we now call the Dogger Bank, became a vast, isolated island, a final refuge for the animals and people of the shrinking heartland. We can imagine the scene, families clinging to the last high ground, watching the sea advance on all sides, their world shrinking from a continent to an island, and then to a collection of smaller, ephemeral islets. They would have become a people of the sea, expert boat builders and fishermen by necessity, their stories and myths surely filled with tales of a great flood, of ancestral lands lost beneath the waves. They were the first climate refugees in British history. The final act of this long drama was focused on the last tenuous thread of land that still connected the British Peninsula to the continent. This was a low ridge of chalk, a continuation of the North Downs in Kent that stretched across to what is now northern France. Through a gap in this ridge flowed the combined waters of the Thames, Rhine, and Meuse, the last remnant of that great Channel River system. This chalk spine was the final dam holding back the North Sea from the deep, dry valley of the English Channel. For a few centuries, Britain was a peninsula connected by a single, narrow isthmus, a precarious thread of white rock in a world of rising blue. The final severing of this connection is the great, violent mystery at the end of this era. Was it a slow, gradual process, the sea finally overtopping the ridge and trickling through, a process of erosion that took centuries? Or was it something far more sudden, far more cataclysmic? Around 150 years ago, a truly monumental event took place off the coast of Norway. A vast, unstable section of the continental shelf, an area of seabed the size of Scotland, collapsed in a gigantic submarine landslide known as the Storegga Slide. This collapse displaced a colossal volume of water, triggering a tsunami of almost unimaginable power that radiated out across the entire North Sea basin. The wave, perhaps as high as a 10-story building in the Shetland Isles, would have devastated the remaining low-lying coasts of Doggerland. It would have swept over the last islands, wiping out the fragile coastal communities. A single, cataclysmic wave that drowned a country and its people in a matter of hours. And it is entirely possible that this was the event that delivered the final fatal blow to the land bridge. We can imagine the tsunami wave surging up the great estuary of the Channel River, a wall of water that crashed against the chalk dam, weakening it, fracturing it, and perhaps initiating the final catastrophic breach. Geologists have found evidence of a mega flood event, a torrent of water carving a deep channel called the Horseshoe Scour into the seabed, suggesting that the final separation was indeed a violent and rapid affair. The North Sea poured through the breach, meeting the Atlantic Ocean rising from the other direction, and in a geological blink of an eye, the English Channel was born. The sound of that final breach, whether a slow roar over centuries or the thunder of a single flood, was the sound of 1 million years of history coming to an end. The moment the waters joined, Britain ceased to be a European peninsula. It became an island. This was not a political or a cultural change. It was a profound physical fact that would shape every subsequent chapter of its story. The easy, casual flow of animals, people, and ideas across a land border was over. From this moment on, every new arrival, every new technology, every new idea would have to make a deliberate and often difficult journey across a treacherous stretch of water. The people who were in Britain at that moment, the Mesolithic forest dwellers, were now, for the first time, truly islanders. They were cut off, their world suddenly defined by a new, powerful, and permanent boundary: the sea. The Paleolithic was over. The Mesolithic would continue. But the stage on which their story and ours would unfold had been irrevocably and forever changed. The last of the chalk ridge had crumbled, and the waters of the North Sea and the Atlantic had finally met in a churning, triumphant embrace. Britain was born. The Mesolithic people who stood on the new white cliffs of Dover and watched the sea where their grandparents had once walked were now, in a profound and irreversible sense, islanders. Their world was smaller, defined by a hard, marine boundary, their future story forever shaped by this newfound isolation. But the ground beneath their feet was not a blank slate. It was a landscape saturated with ghosts, a land that had been a stage for a human drama of almost unimaginable length, a story whose previous chapters had been torn out, scattered, and buried by the relentless cycles of ice and thaw. The true legacy of the Paleolithic is not a continuous, unbroken story, but a collection of faint and haunting echoes, whispers left behind in the bone, the stone, and deep within the very code of life itself. To walk across the modern British landscape is to walk across a library where almost every book has been burned. What we have left are a few scattered, fire-damaged pages, precious and tantalizingly incomplete. In a crumbling cliff in Norfolk, we have a single page of footprints, a fleeting moment from the first million-year-old chapter written by the mysterious Happisburgh pioneers. In a gravel pit in Sussex, we find a chapter on the masterful Homo heidelbergensis, told not in words, but in the form of hundreds of perfectly symmetrical hand axes, their edges still sharp enough to tell a story of immense skill and organized butchery. From the ancient gravels of the Thames, we have a single, frustratingly incomplete sentence in the form of the Swanscombe skull, a fossil that asks more questions than it answers about the lineage that would lead to the Neanderthals. The legacy of the Neanderthals themselves is written in the sharp, clever flakes of the Levallois technique, a testament to a mind capable of profound foresight, a story of a people who endured here longer than anyone, only to be erased by the advancing ice. Each of these chapters is a separate story. They are not connected by a single plot. The people of Boxgrove were not the descendants of the people of Happisburgh. The Neanderthals were not the children of the Swanscombe woman, but a different branch of the family that arrived much later. And the modern humans who engraved the bison at Creswell Crags and fashioned the skullcups at Gough's Cave were a different species altogether, arriving after another great silence. The overwhelming archaeological legacy of Paleolithic Britain is one of discontinuity, of profound and repeated absence. It is the story of a flickering light, a candle of human presence that was lit, burned brightly for a time, and was then snuffed out by the cold. leaving the room in darkness for 50 or 100,000 years before a new hand with a new spark would try to light it again. The deepest legacy, then, is not in any single artifact, but in the sheer, humbling scale of the abandonments, a testament to the supreme power of the planet's climate to edit the human story at will. But what of a more intimate legacy, one written not in stone, but in blood and bone? Does the DNA of the people living in Britain today hold any of these ancient echoes? The answer for the deepest past is a simple and definitive no. The Ice Ages, particularly the last glacial maximum, were a perfect genetic reset button. Every single human who had lived in Britain before that great freeze, every Heidelbergensis, every Neanderthal, every Gravettian pioneer, like the young man of Paviland, left no surviving descendants on the island. Their lines were either extinguished or had retreated so far into the continent that their contribution to the modern British gene pool is effectively zero. The long tangled branch of the Neanderthals was pruned from our family tree entirely. Modern Europeans do carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a legacy of that brief period of interbreeding when our species first left Africa. But the specific Neanderthals who lived and died in Britain are, in a genetic sense, gone without a trace. The true genetic story of the British people begins with those last Paleolithic hunters, the ones who made the final journey across Doggerland and were then trapped by the rising seas. And it is here, in a cave that we have already visited, that the most astonishing echo of all was found. Remember Gough's Cave, the site of the ritual skull cups? In 1903, long before the cannibalism was understood, another complete skeleton was found there, this one carefully buried. For decades, he was just another old skeleton. But in the 1990s, he was dated to around 10,000 years ago. A Mesolithic man who had lived and died just as the forests were returning. He was nicknamed Cheddar Man. And in 2018, scientists were able to extract a full genome from his ancient DNA, a scientific miracle that allowed them, for the first time, to look into the face of one of the first true Britons. The results were a revelation that completely overturned a century of assumptions. Cheddar Man had dark brown, almost black skin. He had piercing blue eyes, and he had dark, curly hair. This was the face of the people who inhabited this island for thousands of years after the ice had gone, a genetic inheritance from a much deeper, warmer African past that had persisted even in this cloudy northern land. He is the ghost at the feast of British history, a reminder that our modern notions of what it means to look British are incredibly recent inventions. He is the final, faint, and most profoundly human echo of the deep past, a single, complete word from a lost world. A world that was about to be changed forever by the arrival of a new people with a new way of life who would sail across the newly formed sea, and so the waters closed. The great chalk bridge to Europe, the last thread connecting Britain to its continental past, was gone, drowned beneath the waves of a new sea. The people who stood on the shore, the people of Cheddar Man with their dark skin and their startling blue eyes, were now islanders, their world contained, their future set on a new and isolated course. Our long, slow journey, a story that began with a single set of footprints on a muddy Norfolk shore almost 1,000,000 years ago, has reached its end. The Paleolithic is over. But to see this as an ending is to misunderstand the immense, dreamlike scale of what we have just witnessed, what we have pieced together. is not a history. It is a ghost story, told from a few scattered bones and stones found between silences so vast they are the true narrative. 1,000,000 years. The number is so large, it becomes an abstraction, a piece of static. But if you were to watch it as a time-lapse film, a single frame for every century, the entire story would be a frantic, flickering strobe of presence and absence. For a few frames, a flicker of light as the Happisburg pioneers walk along their lost river. Then 10,000 frames of pure, featureless white as the Anglian ice sheet scours the world clean. Another flicker, this one brighter and longer, as the master butchers of Boxgrove hunt their giant elephants under a warm Hoxnean sun. Then darkness again, a new flicker, the Neanderthals, a long, steady, enduring flame that burns for 60,000 years, a light of resilience and compassion in the face of unimaginable hardship. And then, the longest darkness of all, 120,000 years of absolute frozen emptiness, a void in the film so profound it feels like the projector has broken. The final part of the reel is the brightest and the most chaotic, the flickering arrival of our own species, the red glow of the burial at Paviland Cave, the sublime ghostly images scratched onto the ceiling at Creswell Crags, the dark and unsettling shadows of the ritual at Guff's Cave. Then a final sudden plunge into the blackness of the Younger Dryas, before the light switches on for good, and the green tide of the new forests floods the screen. The real main characters of this story were never human. They were the great, slow, grinding gods of ice and water. The hominins, in all their different forms, the brave antecessor, the brilliant Heidelbergensis, the enduring Neanderthalensis, and finally, our own clever, creative, and contradictory selves, were merely the supporting cast. We were the fleeting inhabitants of a stage that was constantly being rebuilt and dismantled by forces utterly beyond our control. The very ground beneath our feet was a temporary arrangement. Britain was not a single place, but a series of different, transient worlds. It was a northern peninsula of Europe, a high, domed polar desert, a subtropical woodland where hippos bathed in the Thames, a vast, open prairie of grass and wind, and finally, an island. And beneath the waves, the true heartland of this last age, Doggerland, sleeps its silent, drowned sleep, its great rivers and rolling hills, now just a ghostly image on a seismic survey, a lost world that holds more of their story than we may ever know. What we are left with is an overwhelming sense of fragility. The candle of human presence in this northern land was so easily, so repeatedly, and so completely snuffed out. And yet, the other side of that fragility is a stubborn, almost inexplicable endurance. After every erasure, after every long silence, when the ice pulled back and the land healed, they always came back. The impulse to explore, to follow the herds, to see what lay over the next hill, seems to be a thread that connects every one of these different kinds of human. They were all pioneers, living on the northernmost edge of their known world, pushing the boundaries of what was possible for their species. That shared spirit is the faint, whispering legacy that ties this million-year story together. And now, our journey through this deep, dreaming past has come to its end. The last fire of the last Paleolithic hunter has burned down to embers, its smoke mingling with the morning mist rising from the new forest. The last flint has been struck. The sounds of the wildwood, the call of the deer, and the cry of the hunting owl are fading now into a deep and peaceful quiet. All that is left is the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the water on a new shore and the profound and healing silence. Let the silence hold you now. Let the deep, slow rhythm of 1,000,000 years of history rock you gently to sleep. Let the vastness of time soothe away your worries and carry you into your own quiet dreams. Good night.